Now, a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing on national security, including the threat of Islamic extremism and efforts to combat ISIS, as well as Iran and Afghanistan. Senator Kelly Ayotte chaired the hearing because the chairman, John McCain, was attending the funeral of Saudi Arabia's King Abdullah. This is 3 hours, 15 minutes.
The Senate Armed Services Committee meets today for its second hearing in a series on global challenges and U.S. national security. Chairman McCain was invited to join the American delegation to the funeral of the King of Saudi Arabia, and he asked that I chair this hearing in his absence. I know he regrets not being able to join all of us today. I request unanimous consent that Chairman McCain's opening statement be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Without objection. I am pleased to welcome three of America's most distinguished military leaders, General Jim Mattis, General Jack Keane, and Admiral William Fallon. I welcome each of you today, and I thank you for your willingness to testify before us. Even more so, I thank you on behalf of this committee and the American people for your decades of brave and honorable service to our country. It is because of leaders like you and the men and women you've commanded and you continue to serve in uniform that Americans enjoy unprecedented freedom, security, and prosperity. Each of you commanded at all levels and ultimately served in positions that required not only a deep knowledge of tactical, operational, and strategic levels of military operations, but also an understanding of national security decision-making at the highest levels. It is that experience at the nexus of military operations and military and strategic national security decision-making that is particularly relevant to our hearing today. There is a broad consensus among national security experts that the threats to the United States and our allies that we are confronting are growing both in complexity and severity. In Ukraine, we have witnessed blatant Russian aggression that has forced the administration to undertake a belated reassessment of the nature of the Putin regime and question long-held assumptions regarding the security situation in Europe. In Iraq and Syria, ISIS has established a safe haven and training ground in the heart of the Middle East that it is using to destabilize the region and threaten the core national security interests of the United States and our allies. Meanwhile, the regime in Tehran seeks to use negotiations to achieve sanctions relief while avoiding a permanent and verifiable end to its nuclear weapons program. Simultaneously, Iran continues to oppress its own people, threaten key allies like Israel, and support terrorist groups like Hezbollah. Across the Middle East and into North Africa, emboldened al-Qaeda affiliates plot attacks against the United States and our allies. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula uses the horrible security situation in Yemen, a country the President cited as recently as September as a counterterrorism success story, to plot and carry out terrorist attacks around the world. In the Asia-Pacific, China is using historic economic growth to build military power that is too often it is using to bully its neighbors and test international laws that are essential to the United States, and our partners' international security and prosperity and the free waters in that region. While each of these threats and challenges are unique, with each of them there is a consistent and concerning gap between the strategies our national security interests require and the strategies that this administration is pursuing. Likewise, with defense sequestration set to return next year, and the threats to our country growing, there is also an increasing gap between the military capabilities we have and the military capabilities that we will need to address these threats. The key question for this panel and for all of us remains, what is the best path forward to address these national security challenges? Few in our country have as much national security wisdom and real-world experience as the members of this panel. Between the three of you, you have more than 115 years of military experience, much of it at the most senior levels of our military. We look forward to hearing your best advice on how the federal government can fulfill its most important responsibility to the American people, and that is protecting the security of the United States of America. Thank you very much, and I would like to turn it over to Senator Reid.
Thank you very much, Senator Ayotte. Let me join you in welcoming our witnesses, extraordinary individuals who served the nation with great distinction and great courage, never broke faith with the men and women they led, which is the highest tribute that anyone can make to a soldier, sailor, and Marine. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Let me also thank Chairman McCain for pulling together this series of hearings and briefings to examine the U.S. global strategy. These discussions will help us inform our consideration of the administration's budget request, which will be coming to us in a few days. Last week, two of the most prominent U.S. strategic thinkers, Dr. Brent Scowcroft and General Brent Scowcroft and Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, discussed a number of issues with the committee. Among these was the need to give multilateral negotiation on Iran's nuclear program sufficient time to reach a conclusion. They urged this body not to press forward with additional sanctions, even if they are prospective in nature. This matter is being discussed at this very moment in the Banking Committee, only a few floors above us, and indeed I have to leave here and go there because I'm a senior member of that committee also, and my colleagues will be taking up the slack, particularly Senator King. I want to thank him. I will return, I hope, to ask questions of the panelists. Much of last week's discussion revolved around the administration's strategy in Iraq and Syria for confronting the regional and global terror threat posed by the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL. General Scowcroft and Dr. Brzezinski stressed that efforts to take on ISIL require a comprehensive approach which includes both political and military elements. We also received testimony last week from the Department of Defense on the administration's program to train and equip the vetted opposition in Syria. This is just one aspect of the administration's approach to the ISIL threat in Iraq and Syria, which is built upon an international coalition, including regional Arab and Muslim states, using economic tools to go after ISIL's financing and a sustained campaign of airstrikes against ISIL leadership and facilities. This morning's hearing provides an opportunity in particular to examine the military aspects of our strategy for addressing the ISIL threat. All three of you have been thoughtful and outspoken in your recommendations for that strategy, some of the aspects of which are reflected in the actions the administration has taken to date. As of January, U.S. and coalition aircraft have flown 16,000 sorties over Iraq and Syria, for which 5,866 have involved kinetic strikes against targets. President Obama has authorized the deployment of over 3,000 military personnel to Iraq to advise and assist Iraq and Kurdish security forces. At the administration's request, the fiscal year 2015 National Defense Authorization Act included $5.6 billion in overseas contingency operations funding for DoD activities in Iraq and Syria, including $1.6 billion for the Iraq Train and Equip program. Also in their testimony last week, General Scowcroft and Dr. Brzezinski emphasized the need to work with and through regional partners in the international community to address the ISIL threat so that the United States does, in their words, end up owning the problem itself. So I hope that our witnesses can bring their perspectives on this very challenging issue of strategy, as Senator Ayotte said, in both Syria, Iraq, and in the region. And again, I think it's appropriate to focus on not only just military aspects, but political and diplomatic initiatives as well as economic initiatives. I want to again thank the witnesses. I particularly want to thank Admiral Fallon, who made a tremendous effort to rearrange his schedule to join us. Thank you, sir, for your efforts. And with that, Madam Chairwoman, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Reid. I would like to start with General Mattis. General Mattis served 42 years in the Marine Corps, including time as Commander of Central Command. We're very glad that you're here today. Thank you so much for being here, General Mattis.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member Reid, distinguished senators of the committee. I have submitted a statement and request to be accepted for the record. During my active duty years, I testified many times before this committee and gained the highest regard for the manner in which you carried out your duties. Through good times and bad, I remain grateful for the support you provided our military. I commend the committee for holding these hearings. As former Secretary of State George Shultz has commented, the world is awash in change. The international order, so painstakingly put together by the greatest generation, coming home from mankind's bloodiest conflict, that international order is under increasing stress. It was created with elements we take for granted today: the United Nations, NATO, the Marshall Plan, Bretton Woods, and more. The constructed order reflected the wisdom of those World War II veterans who recognized no nation lived as an island, and we needed new ways to deal with challenges that, for better or worse, impacted all nations. Like it or not, today we are part of this larger world, and we must carry out our part. We cannot wait for problems to arrive here, or it will be too late. The international order built on the state system is not self-sustaining. It demands tending by an America that leads wisely, standing unapologetically for the freedoms each of us in this room have enjoyed. The hearing today addresses the need for America to adapt to changing circumstances, to come out now from our reactive crouch and take a firm strategic stance in defense of our values. While we recognize that we owe future generations the same freedoms that we enjoy, the challenge lies in how to carry out that responsibility. To do so, America needs a refreshed national strategy. The Congress can play a key role in crafting a coherent strategy with bipartisan support. Doing so requires us to look beyond the events that are currently consuming the executive branch. There's an urgent need to stop reacting to each immediate vexing issue in isolation. Such response often creates unanticipated second-order effects and even more problems for us. The Senate Armed Services Committee is uniquely placed in our system of government to guide, oversee, and ensure that we act strategically and morally, using America's ability to inspire as well as its ability to intimidate to ensure freedom for future generations. I suggest the best way to get to the essence of these issues and to help you crafting America's response to a rapidly changing security environment is simply to ask the right questions. If I were in your shoes, these are some of the questions I would ask. What are the key threats to our vital interests? The intelligence community should delineate and provide an initial prioritization of these threats for your consideration. By rigorously defining the problems we face, you will enable a more intelligent and focused use of the resources allocated for national defense. Is our intelligence community fit for its expanding purpose? Today, ladies and gentlemen, we have less military shock absorber in our smaller military, so less ability to take surprise and stride, and fewer forward deployed forces overseas to act as sentinels. Accordingly, we need more early warning. Working with the intel community, you should question if we are adequately funding the intel agencies to reduce the chance of our defenses being caught flat-footed. We know that the foreseeable future is not foreseeable. Incorporating the broadest issues into your assessments, you should consider what we must do if the national debt is assessed to be the biggest national security threat we face. As President Eisenhower noted, the foundation of military strength is our economic strength. In a few short years, however, we will be paying interest on our debt, and it will be a bigger bill than what we pay today for defense. Much of that interest money is destined to leave America for overseas. If we refuse to reduce our debt or pay down our deficit, what is the impact on the national security for future generations who will inherit this irresponsible debt and the taxes to service it? No nation in history has maintained its military power if it failed to keep its fiscal house in order. How do you urgently halt the damage caused by sequestration? No foe in the field can wreak such havoc on our security that mindless sequestration is achieving today. Congress passed it because it was viewed as so injurious that it would force wise choices. It has failed in that regard, and today we use arithmetic vs. sound thinking to run our government, despite the emerging enemy threats. This committee must lead the effort to repeal sequestration that is costing military readiness and long-term capability while sapping our troops' morale. Without predictability in budget matters, no strategy can be implemented by your military leaders. In our approach to the world, we must be willing to ask strategic questions. In the Middle East, where our influence is at its lowest point in 4 decades, we see a region erupting in crises. We need a new security architecture for the Mideast, built on sound policy, one that permits us to take our own side in this fight. Crafting such a policy starts with asking a fundamental question and then the follow-on questions. The fundamental question, I believe, is political Islam in our best interest? If not, what is our policy to authoritatively support the countervailing forces? Violent jihadist terrorists cannot be permitted to take refuge behind false religious garb and leave us unwilling to define this threat with the clarity it deserves. We have many potential allies around the world and in the Middle East who will rally to us, but we have not been clear about where we stand in defining or dealing with the growing violent jihadist terrorist threat. Iran is a special case that must be dealt with as a threat to regional stability, nuclear and otherwise. I believe that you should question the value of Congress adding new sanctions while international negotiations are ongoing, vice having them ready should the negotiations for preventing their nuclear weapons capability and implementing stringent monitoring break down. Further question now if we have the right policies in place when Iran creates more mischief in Lebanon, Iraq, Bahrain, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere in the region, recognizing that regional counterweights like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the rest of the Gulf Cooperation Council can reinforce us if they understand our policy. In Afghanistan, we need to consider if we're asking for the same outcome there as we saw last summer in Iraq, should we pull out all our troops on the administration's proposed timeline. Echoing the same military advice given on the same issue about Iraq when we pulled the troops out, the gains achieved at great cost against our enemy in Afghanistan are reversible. We should recognize that we may not want this fight, but the barbarity of an enemy that kills women and children and has refused to break with al-Qaeda needs to be fought. More broadly, is the U.S. military being developed to fight across the spectrum of combat? Knowing that enemies always will move against our perceived weakness, our forces must be capable of missions from nuclear deterrence to counterinsurgency and everything in between, now including the pervasive cyber domain. While surprise is always a factor, this committee can ensure that we have the fewest big regrets when the next surprise occurs. While we don't want or need a military that is at the same time dominant and irrelevant, you must sort this out and deny funding for bases or capabilities no longer needed. The nuclear stockpile must be tended to, and fundamental questions must be asked and answered. We must clearly establish the role of our nuclear weapons. Do they serve solely to deter nuclear war? If so, we should say so, and the resulting clarity will help to determine the number we need. I think, too, you should ask, is it time to reduce the triad to a dyad, removing the land-based missiles? This would also reduce the false alarm danger. Could we re-energize the arms control effort by only counting warheads, vice launchers? Was the Russian test violating the INF Treaty simply a blunder on their part or a change in policy? And what is our appropriate response? The reduced size of our military drives the need to ask different questions. Our military is uniquely capable and the envy of the world, but are we resourcing it to ensure we have the highest quality troops, the best equipment, and the toughest training? With a smaller military comes the need for troops kept at the top of their game. When we next put them in harm's way, it must be the enemy's longest day and worst day. Tiered readiness with a smaller force must be closely scrutinized to ensure we aren't merely hollowing out the military. While sequestration is the nearest threat to this national treasure that is the U.S. military, sustaining it as the world's best when it's smaller will need your critical oversight. Are the Navy and our expeditionary forces receiving the support they need in a world where America's naval role is more pronounced because we have fewer forces posted overseas? With the cutbacks to the Army and Air Force and fewer forces around the world, military aspects of our strategy will inevitably become more naval in character. This will provide the decision time for political leaders considering employment of additional forms of military power. Your resourcing of our naval and expeditionary forces will need to take this development into account. Today, I question if our shipbuilding budget is sufficient, especially in light of the situation in the South China Sea. While our efforts in the Pacific to keep positive relations with China are well and good, these efforts must be paralleled by a policy to build the counterbalance if China continues to expand its bullying role in the South China Sea and elsewhere. That counterbalance must deny China veto power over territorial, security, and economic conditions in the Pacific, building support for our diplomatic efforts to maintain stability and economic prosperity so critical to our economy. In light of the worldwide challenges to the international order, we are nonetheless shrinking our military. We have to then ask, are we adjusting our strategy and taking into account a reduced role for that shrunken military? Strategy connects end, ways, and means. With less military available, we must reduce our appetite for using it. Prioritization is needed if we are to remain capable of the most critical mission for which we have a military, to fight on short notice and defend the country. We have to ask, does our strategy and associated military planning, as Senator Reid pointed out, take into account our nation's increased need for allies? The need for stronger alliances comes more sharply into focus as we shrink the military. No nation can, on its own, do all that is necessary for its own security. Further, history reminds us that countries with allies generally defeat those without allies. As Churchill intimated, however, the only thing harder than fighting with allies is fighting without them. This committee should track closely an increased military capability to work with allies, the NATO alliance being foremost but not our only focus. In reference to NATO and in light of the Russian violations of international borders, we must ask if the NATO alliance efforts have adjusted to the unfortunate and dangerous mode the Russian leadership has slipped into. With regard to tightening the bond between our smaller military and those other militaries we may need at our side in future fights, the convoluted foreign military sales system needs your challenge. Hopefully it can be put in order before we drive more potential partners to equip themselves with foreign equipment, a move that makes it harder to achieve needed interoperability with our allies and undercuts America's industrial base. Currently, the system fails to reach its potential. As we attempt to restore stability to the state system and international order, a critical question will be, is America good for its word? When we make clear a position or give our word about something, our friends and even our enemies must recognize that we are good for it. Otherwise, dangerous miscalculations can occur. When the decision is made to employ our forces in combat by the Commander-in-Chief, the committee should still ask, is the military being employed with the proper authority? For example, are the political objectives clearly defined and achievable? Murky or quixotic political end states can condemn us to entering wars we don't know how to end. Notifying the enemy in advance of our withdrawal dates or reassuring the enemy that we will not use certain capabilities like our ground forces should be avoided. Such announcements do not take the place of mature, well-defined end states, nor do they contribute to ending wars as rapidly as possible on favorable terms. You should ask, is the theater of war itself sufficient for effective prosecution? We have witnessed safe havens prolonging war. If the defined theater is insufficient, the plan itself needs to be challenged. Ask, is the authority for detaining prisoners of war appropriate for the enemy and type war we are fighting? We have observed the perplexing lack of detainee policy that has resulted in the return of released prisoners to the battlefield. We should not engage in another fight without resolving this issue up front, treating hostile forces, in fact, as hostile. You have to also ask, are America's diplomatic, economic, and other assets aligned to the war aims? We have experienced the military alone trying to achieve tasks outside its expertise. When we take the serious decision to fight, we must bring to bear all our nation's resources and you should question how the diplomatic and development efforts will be employed to build momentum for victory, and our nation's strategy demands that comprehensive approach. Finally, the culture of our military and its rules are designed to bring about battlefield success in the most atavistic environment on earth. No matter how laudable in terms of a progressive country's instincts, this committee needs to consider carefully any proposed changes to military rules, traditions, and standards that bring non-combat emphasis to combat units. There is a great difference between military service in dangerous circumstances and serving in a combat unit whose role is to search out, close with, and kill the enemy at close quarters. This committee has a responsibility for imposing reason over impulse when proposed changes could reduce the combat capability of our forces at the point of contact with the enemy. Ultimately, we need the foresight of this committee acting in its sentinel and oversight role to draw us out of our reactive stance that we've fallen into and chart a strategic way ahead. Our national security strategy needs your bipartisan direction. In some cases, you may need to change our processes for developing an integrated national strategy, because mixing capable people with their good ideas and bad processes results in the bad processes defeating good people's ideas 9 times out of 10. This is an urgent matter because in an interconnected age when opportunistic adversaries can work in tandem to destroy stability and prosperity, our country needs to regain its strategic footing. We need to bring the clarity to our efforts before we lose the confidence of the American people and the support of potential allies. This committee, I believe, can play an essential strategic role in this regard. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you, General Mattis. Next, I would like to introduce General Keane. General Keane is a Vietnam combat veteran, the former Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, one of the architects of the successful surge in Iraq, and the current chairman of the Institute for the Study of War. General Keane.
Madam Chairman, Senator Ayotte, and Ranking Minority Senator Reid, members of this distinguished committee, thank you for inviting me to testify on such a critical issue as America's global security challenges. It's always a privilege to be with this committee. It's been 15+ years in association for me, and whose reputation for tackling tough issues has always been appreciated. I'm honored to be here with General Jim Mattis and Admiral Fallon, both highly respected military leaders I've known for years. Listen, I don't know what the criteria for panel selection was, but obviously we have something in common. We're all getting older and we're 4 stars retired. But the thing that we also have in common, we are very direct, we are very straightforward, and we sure as hell are opinionated. So I'm usually sitting next to somebody who's nuanced, circumspect, etc. You're not going to get that from the 3 of us today. We don't always agree, but you're going to know what we're thinking. Please accept my written testimony for the record, and I will briefly outline those remarks. I put some extra in there because congratulations to the new members who have joined this committee. There's some background information in there that you may feel helpful to you, and I appreciate Senator McCain giving us a little extra time this morning on such a complex subject. You know, the United States is confronting emerging security challenges on a scale not seen since the rise of the Soviet Union to superpower status following World War II. With radical Islam morphing into a global jihad, Iran seeking regional hegemony, and revisionist powers, Russia and China, capable of employing varying degrees of sophistication, disruptive methods of war that will severely test the United States military's traditional methods of projecting and sustaining power abroad. Given U.S. defense budget projections, the United States will have to confront these challenges without its long-standing decided advantage in the scale of resources it is able to devote to the competition. Indeed, the Budget Control Act, or sequestration, is not only irresponsible in the face of these emerging challenges, it is downright reckless. Let me briefly outline the major security challenges and what we can do about them. Radical Islam, as much as Nazism and communism, both geopolitical movements, ideologically driven, were the major security challenges of the 20th century, radical Islam is the major security challenge of our generation. Radical Islam, as I'm defining it for today's discussion, consists of three distinct movements who share a radical fundamentalist ideology, use jihad or terror to achieve objectives, yet compete with each other for influence and power. I provided some maps behind my testimony that you can use, and there's some display maps here in the committee room which you may be challenged to be able to see. First, the Shia-based Iranian-sponsored radical Islamic movement that began in 1979 with the formation of the Islamic State of Iran. In 1980, Iran declared the United States as a strategic enemy, and its goal is to drive the United States out of the region, achieve regional hegemony, and destroy the State of Israel. It uses proxies primarily as the world's #1 state sponsoring terrorism. 30-plus years, Iran has used these proxies to attack the United States. To date, the result is U.S. troops left Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq, while Iran has direct influence and some control over Beirut, Lebanon, Gaza, Damascus, Syria, Baghdad, Iraq, and now Sana'a, Yemen, as you can see on the map. Is there any doubt that Iran is on the march and is systematically moving toward their regional hegemonic objective? Iran has been on a 20-year journey to acquire nuclear weapons, simply because they know it guarantees preservation of the regime and makes them, along with their partners, the dominant power in the region, thereby capable of expanding their control and influence. Add to this their ballistic missile delivery system, and Iran is not only a threat to the region, but to Europe as well, and as they increase missile range, eventually a threat to the United States. And as we know, a nuclear arms race, because of their nuclear ambition, is on the horizon for the Middle East. Second, the al-Qaeda Sunni-based movement declared war on the United States in the early 90s, desires to drive the United States out of the region, dominate all Muslim lands, and as the most ambitious radical Islamic movement, eventually achieve world domination. As you can see on the map, al-Qaeda and its affiliates exceeds Iran in beginning to dominate multiple countries. In fact, al-Qaeda has grown fourfold in the last 5 years. Third, the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, ISIS, is an outgrowth from al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was defeated in Iraq by 2009. After U.S. troops pulled out of Iraq in 2011, ISIS reemerged as a terrorist organization in Iraq, moved into Syria in 2012, and began seizing towns and villages from the Syria-Iraq border all the way to the western Syria, from Aleppo to Damascus. After many terrorist attacks and assassinations in Mosul and Anbar province in 2013, to set the conditions for follow-on operations, ISIS launched a conventional attack back into Iraq, beginning in 2014 with the seizure of Fallujah and culminating in the seizure of Mosul and many other towns and villages. Is it possible to look at that map in front of you and claim that the United States policy and strategy is working, or that al-Qaeda is on the run? It is unmistakable that our policies have failed, and the unequivocal explanation is U.S. policy has focused on disengaging from the Middle East, while our stated policy is pivoting to the East. U.S. policymakers choose to ignore the very harsh realities of the rise of radical Islam. In my view, we became paralyzed by the fear of adverse consequences in the Middle East after fighting two wars. Moreover, as we sit here this morning, in the face of radical Islam, U.S. policymakers refuse to accurately name the movement as radical Islam. We further choose not to define it, nor explain its ideology. And most critical, we have no comprehensive strategy to stop it or defeat it. We are reduced to a very piecemeal effort using drones in Yemen and Pakistan, a vital tactic but not a strategy, and air power in Iraq and Syria, while insisting an unproven indigenous ground force. Our partnering program with other nations is fragmented with no overall strategy. This approach almost certainly guarantees we will be incrementally engaged against one radical group after another with no end in sight. What can we do? To stop and defeat a global radical Islamic movement and Iranian regional hegemony, requires a broad, long-term, comprehensive strategic approach with the strategic objectives both near and long-term supporting that strategy. World leaders understood how formidable communist ideology and the Soviet threat was to the world order and formed political and military alliances. Forming similar alliances today offers the opportunity by member nations to develop a comprehensive strategy to discuss and set goals for necessary political and social reforms and to share intelligence, technology, equipment, and training. The alliance is mostly about supporting countries in the region to make internal changes and to assist comprehensively in countering radical Islam. We should rely on some of the thoughtful leaders in and outside the region to assist in forming this alliance. This is not about major military intervention by the United States. It is about assisting alliance members with training their counterterrorism force and their conventional military and counterinsurgency, and yes, conducting counterterrorism operations as required. While killing and capturing terrorists is key, so is the strategy to organize an alliance-wide effort to undermine the radical Islamist ideology, to counter its narrative, to counter recruiting, and to target outside financing. On Iraq and Syria, the ISIS advance is stalled in Iraq due to effective air power, with modest gains in retaking lost territory. However, a successful counteroffensive to retake Mosul and Anbar provinces is a very real challenge. No one knows for certain how the indigenous force consisting of the Iraqi army, Peshmerga, Sunni tribes, and Shia militia will perform. The United States should plan now to have U.S. coalition advisors accompany frontline troops with the added capability to call in airstrikes. Direct action special operation forces, both ground and air, should assist by targeting ISIS leaders. U.S. and coalition combat brigades should be designated for deployment and moved to Kuwait to be ready for employment if the counteroffensive stalls or is defeated. The alternative? We wait another couple of years and try again. The Syria policy is a failure. ISIS is continuing to advance throughout Syria and is gaining ground, taking new territory. You can see that on the other map, and even approaching Damascus and attacking south of Damascus. The plans for training and assisting the Free Syrian Army is not robust enough. 5,000 in 1 year. I know you received the classified briefing on it, so you know more about it than I. And permitting Assad to bomb the FSA faster than new members are trained makes no sense. The United States should heed the advice of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, and Turkey to establish a no-fly zone and to shut down Assad's air power and a buffer zone to protect refugees. On Iran, the long-term goal for any alliance that is formed should be Iran's regime change, or at least a collapse of the existing government framework similar to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the reason is clear. Iran's stated regional hegemonic objectives are incongruous with the peace, prosperity, and stability of the Middle East. Iran cannot be permitted to acquire a nuclear weapon or a threshold capability allowing rapid nuclear development. Sadly, we are already about there. Congress should do two things now in reference to Iran. One, authorize increased sanctions now with automatic implementation if talks are extended or fail. And two, legislate ratification of any deal by the Senate. On Afghanistan, the political situation in Afghanistan has improved considerably with the reform leadership of Ashraf Ghani, but the security situation remains at risk. While the security situation in the south is relatively stable, the situation in the east is not. The problem is the area generally from Kabul to the Pakistani border is the domain of the Haqqani network. Haqqani network has not been rooted out of their support zones and safe areas in Afghanistan. This is a serious problem for the ANSF. It follows that the ANSF needs the funding support to support its current troop levels of 352,000 and much-needed U.S. and coalition troops to conduct counterterrorism and to advise, train, and assist the ANSF beyond 2016. We also need to target the Haqqani network in its sanctuary in Pakistan in the vicinity of Miram Shah and the Fatah. All we accomplished in Afghanistan will be at risk, as it was in Iraq, if the troops are pulled out, not based on the conditions on the ground. How can we not learn the obvious and painful lesson from Iraq? The security challenges posed by revisionist Eurasian nations, Russia and China. In Europe, Russia's recent behavior, I think, suggests that its 2008 military campaign against Georgia was not an aberration, but rather an initial effort to overturn the prevailing regional order. By seizing the Crimea, supporting trumped-up rebel forces in eastern Ukraine, and engaging in military deployments that directly threaten its Baltic neighbors, Moscow has made it clear that it does not accept the political map of post-Cold War Europe. I believe we need to realistically conclude that Moscow is also willing to challenge the very existence of NATO. What can be done? Given the dramatic drop in oil prices, Russia is beginning to suffer economically and is likely headed toward a recession, if not already there. Additional tough sanctions should be back on the table to coerce Russia to stop the Ukraine aggression. It is a disgrace that once again we have refused to assist the people being oppressed when all they ask for is the weapons to fight. We should robustly arm and assist Ukraine. Additionally, NATO military presence in Central Europe, NATO military presence from Central Europe should be significantly shifted to the Baltics and Eastern Europe with plans for permanent bases. A clear signal of Article 5 intent must be sent to Moscow. These actions will strengthen our diplomatic efforts, which to date have failed. China's continuing economic growth has fueled a major conventional buildup that is beginning to shift the local balance of power in its favor. As a result, Beijing has been emboldened to act more assertively toward its neighbors, especially in expanding its territorial claims, which include not only Taiwan, but also most of the South China Sea Islands and Japan's Senkaku Islands. China has embarked on a strategy of regional domination at the expense of U.S. interests as a Pacific nation and decades of partnership with allied countries in the region. What can be done? Develop a regional strategy with our allies to counter China's desire for dominant control and influence. Recognize that China's military strategy to defeat U.S. reliance on military information networks, which they believe alone may defeat the United States militarily, which is quite interesting, and their exploding precision strike capability threatens ground and naval forces, forward staging bases, and air and seaports of debarkation. The United States no longer enjoys the commanding position in the precision strike regime that it occupied in the 2 decades following the Cold War. We should stress test U.S. regional military defense to counter China's threat and recognize that a change in regional defense strategy and capabilities is likely. Lastly, sequestration. It must be repealed and reasonable resources restored to meet the emerging security challenges. All the services have a need to capitalize their investment accounts and to maintain readiness, which is rapidly eroding. In conclusion, given the emerging security challenges and limited resources, the need for a well-crafted regional defense strategy in an overall integrated national security and defense strategy posture is clear, more so now than any time, I believe, since World War II. Yet, this is not what we do. What we do is the QDR every 4 years, which is largely driven by process and far too focused on the budget. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, General Keane. Admiral Fallon, thank you, Admiral Fallon, for being here. Admiral Fallon is a Vietnam veteran who served 40 years in the Navy, including as commander of U.S. Central Command. Thank you for being here today, Admiral Fallon.
Thank you, Senator. Madam Chairwoman, Senator Reid, members of the committee, Thank you, first of all, for your essential and enduring support of our men and women in uniform, certainly for the many years in which I was honored to serve with them and continuing today. And thank you for the opportunity to address this distinguished body and offer my perspectives on current threats to national security, American foreign policy, and national defense topics. There are certainly many areas of concern around the world. We see the most spectacularly highlighted regularly by the media, and you've heard a long litany of these things mentioned already today. First of all, I believe that a coherent national security strategy requires a long-term focus with well-thought-out objectives. We should resist reactive responses and attempts to find near-term fixes to pop-up issues which are going to arise continuously and compete for attention with what we should determine are the highest priority national interests. In surveying the worldscape today, I'd suggest that we focus on where we, as a nation, want to be in the future. My vote would be for improving world security and stability with more people around the world enjoying a better life in conditions of their choosing, with responsible elected leaders providing good governance and respect for human dignity. This scenario, clearly in our better national interest, is not going to happen without lots of hard work, informed and guided by an effective national security strategy. The United States government has provided and must continue to provide leadership, good example, and active political, economic, and military security assistance in working towards these desired objectives. The fundamental prerequisite for any successful U.S. national security strategy is a sound and strong domestic foundation. Our credibility in the world is based on the example of our actions and how people perceive we might act in current and future situations. It's fair to wonder if people in other parts of the world take us seriously when they observe partisan political bickering that precludes agreement on fundamental issues like a national operating budget or cyber policies, and seemingly ever-changing policies and priorities. Our military capability is an essential element of national power and one of many key tools which include diplomatic, development, economic, financial, political, and certainly moral leadership. We face tough choices today about if, when, and where to employ our military forces. We also face some tough choices on what to do, how to equip them, and what capabilities ought to be priorities. We can't have everything. Some people would propose an endless list of things that we could never afford. We've got to make the choices. As we contemplate the myriad challenges to world stability and U.S. security, we should first acknowledge, distasteful as it might be, the reality that nuclear weapons and aspirations for them continue to proliferate. In this regard, it's discouraging to note that after more than 2 decades of nuclear counterproliferation progress, fueled in large measure by the Nunn-Lugar Initiative, Russian-U.S. cooperation appears to have ground to a halt in the wake of dangerous Russian bad behavior. U.S. strategy in dealing with the potential use of these weapons of mass destruction has been heretofore successful with our national strategic deterrent force. But the critical components of this force have been aging without significant upgrade. Modernization of the force, particularly the survivability of the sea-based deterrent, should be a top priority consideration for us to remain credible in deterring the worst-case scenarios. In my view, one of our most important strategic interests, with huge implications for national security and the stability of the vast Asia-Pacific region, is our long-term relationship with China. Mutually beneficial in many respects, it has other dimensions, notably in the areas of cybersecurity, military expansion, and regional disputes with neighboring countries, which are a cause for concern and need to be addressed. A key focal point of this hearing is conflict in the Middle East and the spread of violent extremism in the region and from it to other places in the world. The Middle East is an area of high interest for us for many reasons, and continue to be buffeted by challenges which have vexed years of U.S. attempts to improve stability in the area. Nonetheless, I believe we should continue to engage in this region, using all aspects of national power, but with the understanding that we are not likely to be successful by mandating U.S. solutions. People in the region are sooner or later going to have to step up and address the issues which torment and divide them. We can and should assist, but we are not going to resolve their problems. Some recommendations for addressing the current challenges from the so-called Daesh in Iraq and Syria, from my perspective, include, first, recognition that in Iraq, success will rest on the ability of the new government of Hyder al-Abadi to convince the majority of his countrymen and women, particularly the Sunni minority, that they will get a fair shake going forward. Absent this political foundation, nothing we do is going to be effective in the long term. Second, getting Islamic leaders, the elites of the Arab countries, to actively counter the extremist ideology and to cut funding for Daesh and other extremists. On a positive note here, I would highlight the recent remarks by Egyptian leader Abdel el-Sisi. And third, I think we should continue U.S. military efforts to work closely with the Iraqi military to enhance their capabilities, increase their combat effectiveness, and to support them with training, air power, and SOF as required to defeat Daesh and to reclaim areas that were overrun last summer. Simultaneously, pressing Daesh in rear areas to degrade and deny their ability to expand and to sustain operations in Iraq. No single one of these actions is going to result in success, but collectively, we have a chance to achieve our general objectives. Combating violent extremism worldwide is going to be a long-term effort requiring close cooperation with allies and willing nations, especially in areas of intelligence sharing, U.S. military training and assistance for our less capable colleagues. In summary, strategic coherence in foreign policy and national security would benefit from strong, credible, and consistent domestic policies and actions to return this great nation to the position of exemplary leadership it's earned and kept for many years in the eyes of people around the world. Building on this position of domestic strength, a thoughtful, focused, and collaborative strategy formulation process to agree on a relatively few high-priority national security goals and objectives should set us on a fair course. At the international level, active engagement using all aspects of national power, underpinned with a strong forward presence by U.S. military forces with credible capabilities, is our best deterrent and response to security threats worldwide. Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to address any specific questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Admiral Fallon. I want to thank each of the members of this panel, and I would like to, first of all, start with General Keane, a question to you about the fight we face against radical Islam. You had said in your testimony that you believed that our policy has failed, that essentially al-Qaeda has grown fourfold in the last 5 years. Can you help us understand what you think would be the strongest strategy in terms of defeating radical Islam? And also, can you speak to the situation in Yemen and what you believe our strategy should be there?
Yes. Well, as you noted, radical Islam is clearly on the rise. And as I noted, as I said in my testimony, I think our policy of disengagement from the Middle East has contributed to that rise. Obviously, this is a very ambitious movement, and they would be making moves in that direction regardless of our actions. Given the scale of it, which I tried to display on the map, which goes from northern and western Africa all the way to South Asia, as you look at all of that red on that map, al-Qaeda Central does not control all of those affiliates. But what they have in common, what their connective tissue is that they share a common geopolitical belief driven by a religious ideology to dominate their host country governments, which they are conducting an insurgency at. And as al-Qaeda Central, I indicated in my testimony, has a very ambitious geopolitical objective, and that is to dominate Muslim lands initially and then world domination. Given that, and given where they are and the swath of territory and countries that they're involved in, there's no way that the United States, in of itself, can deal with the scale of this problem, nor should it. So, in my judgment, That's why I looked to how did we deal with communist ideology, which was a very similar movement, ambitious geopolitical movement, world domination, and we dealt with it, I think, in a very wise fashion. We brought countries together who shared values, who shared political beliefs, and formed a political and military alliance. There is no other way, I believe, that you can cope with this scale of a problem without bringing the countries involved together, whether they're in the region or have interests outside of the region, as many do because of the export of terrorism to their countries, and develop a strategy to deal with it. This isn't about the United States driving a strategy. This is about bringing countries together, because much of what has to be done in the region where the radical Islamists are growing has to do with those countries themselves, has to do with the conditions that exist in those countries. The issues simply are, and what the Arab Spring was about, if you recall, it was about seeking political reform, social justice, and economic opportunity. Nobody was demonstrating in the streets for radical Islam, but the radical Islamists saw the Arab Spring as an opportunity, and it became an accelerant for them because they saw political and social upheaval, and they could take advantage of it. So using that as a backdrop, it drives you. Those issues are still there. Political reform, social injustice, and lack of economic opportunity. We have to bring those countries together to recognize some of those problems. Those are long-term answers. And then the near-term problems deal with what General Mattis was pointing out as well. We have to share intelligence. We have to share technology. We have to share training. We can help a lot. We have been fighting this enemy for 13 years. We have learned a lot, and so has many of our allies. There's much that we can do if we take a comprehensive strategic approach to it, as opposed to what I think is a fragmented approach now, and it doesn't get at the long-term problem. You have to see the long-term solution and then start approaching it with near-term and mid-term objectives to accomplish it. That, I think, is the only answer that's possible, given what we're facing. Otherwise, we're just going to protract this thing and take these things on. What after ISIS? Will there be something after ISIS we'll have to deal with? You betcha, if we don't take a comprehensive approach to deal with it. In terms of Yemen, I mean, it's very frustrating to watch what's happened. We have been working with a host country government in Yemen. We've been conducting direct action missions with them against an insurgency in their country. This is AQAP, as we well know. This is the organization, given the pressure that the previous administration and this administration put on al-Qaeda Central, they knew that they no longer had global reach. And al-Qaeda Central always wanted to take the jihad to Europe and to the United States so they could drive us out of the region, and most importantly, drive our ideas out of the region, which are democracy and capitalism, which is an anathema to them. The fact is they franchised out the AQAP, and they gave them some leaders to do it, and this is a force that's not only conducting an insurgency to overthrow a government, but put together capabilities to conduct out-of-region attacks in the United States and most recently in Paris, France. I think we got a big question mark on where we're going forward. This is going to have to play out in front of us. There's serious challenges in Yemen, given what's taken place with the Iranian-imposed overthrow of the government. They are also opposed to AQAP, but they also fundamentally opposed to America and its interests. So I think it begs the question whether they're going to be able to have the kind of cooperation with the new government in Yemen that we had with the old government.
Thank you, General Keane. I would call on Senator Reid right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. General Mattis, you've made it very clear that we have capabilities, particularly with respect to the Middle East in terms of military solutions, but you've also last July in Aspen pointed out that there's very high cost there. And if we choose to use military, we have to, you know, as you said out there, if Americans take ownership of this, referring to Syria, this is going to be a full-throated, very, very serious war with large costs. That's still your view, I assume?
Yes, sir, it is.
And can you give us an idea of the scale of those costs? I mean, in terms of forces and just the top line, because I think your point's very well made, which is basically if we're going to go into something, we've got to go into it with the idea of it's going to be difficult and costly.
Senator, what you just quoted was something I'd said in response to a question, as you recall. I think in this case we have to get to a very detailed level of understanding what is the political objective we are out to accomplish. And frankly, I don't know what it is right now. Once we define that, I'd say to a Jesuit's level of definition, a very strict definition, at that point, we then allocate the means. Those means would be covert, diplomatic, educational, economic, and military. And if we orchestrate this correctly, as has been pointed out by the other members of the panel, with allies, the clarity and the commitment of the United States can draw in the full commitment of others. We should not think that a tentative or half-hearted commitment on our part, or saying we're willing to go in, but we're not willing to really do the fighting, would draw a full commitment from others. They're going to be willing to match us, but when you live right next to this terrible threat, they have to assume that we're in fully, or they're going to have to moderate their response. Once we show, I think, that level of commitment, our requirement would actually go down because others would be willing to come in full-throated in our support. But it would be a serious operation, no doubt, Senator.
Thank you. General Keane, do you agree with Admiral Fallon's point that unless there's a political cohesion in Iraq, that the government recognizes and integrates the various sectarian groups, that military efforts will be probably ineffectual?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can be a little bit encouraged by a body and his movements. I had some people from the Institute for the Study of War just returned from Baghdad, meeting with government officials and military officials. A body is moving in the right direction. That's good news. But let's be honest here. That what Maliki's malfeasance and nefarious character and the way he undermined political inclusion, despite his rhetoric in Iraq, particularly after we pulled out of there, was tragic. The Sunni tribes are key, as Fox pointed out. And right now, while some of them are fighting against ISIS, most of them are not. And the harsh reality is, to get them to move, actually to take ISIS on, they will have to be convinced that there is reckoning for long-term political inclusion in this new government. It is a major issue for us. Anbar province will be largely Sunni tribes with some Iraqi army assisting to retake that river valley. Peshmerga will not participate. Sunni tribes will also be needed to participate in a counteroffensive to retake Mosul. While they will not be the main force, they will need to be a supporting force because of the tribes that are up in that region. So yes, it's key, and I think we've known that from the outset.
So in effect, the politics will drive the military operations. I mean, without effective political reconciliation or signals from Baghdad, our military efforts, as strenuous as we may mount, won't be particularly successful. No.
Yeah, it'd be hard to visualize a scenario with a successful counteroffensive to retake the territory that's been lost without significant Sunni tribe participation in that.
Let me switch again to Admiral Fallon. Again, thank you once again, sir, for making yourself available. But one of the points that was raised in the course of the testimony was the radical Islam. But one of the complicating factors is within this radical Islam, you have Sunni radicals, jihadists, and then you have Shia radicals, and they have a mutual animosity which might be argued is even greater than our animosity towards other groups. The Sunni, Shia. Sunni believes the Shia are apostates, et cetera. How do you reconcile that in terms of our operations in the Middle East, particularly in terms of Iran? Right now, Iranian forces, or Shia militias, let me say, are paralleling our activities in Iraq in terms of going after ISIL. How do we, that complicates an already complicated situation. Any comments you have?
Piece of cake.
Yeah.
So we wish. I think reality here, Senator, is that these things are really complex. There are a host of issues and interests in every one of these conflicts. You pick the country, pick the region, and I think that we might consider a couple of things. First of all, that in these really particularly vexing things that have so many aspects, we probably ought to step back and take a look at again our long-term large interests. So Iran has been a problem for us for decades. It's exacerbated by the fact that we've had no interaction to speak of until very recently for these many decades. We find their activities extremely distasteful. We basically detest many of the things they've done and continue to do. They promote a brand of radicalism that has spread well beyond their borders. And we've been at our wits' end to try to figure out what to do. Well, my thought here is that sooner or later, we're going to have to seriously sit down, as I think we're trying to start, and have a dialogue with these guys. We're not going to, we could, one option would be to invade Iraq, or Iran rather. That's been proposed before. At what cost? I mean, anybody here want to push that idea forward in a meaningful way? I doubt it. So at some time, we're going to have to figure out how to come to grips with this. So how do you do that? You recognize that everybody's got a dog in a fight. They all want something. And we ought to, I think, decide what things that we might accept, some role for them in the region, I would think, but some things we're not going to accept. We don't want any part of the nuclear weapons program that they seem to be embarked on. But their time, I think, is being stressed right now. Certainly the economic conditions, there has been apparently a pretty notable effect of sanctions working against them. And of course, the people that usually take the brunt of this are the common folk, not the leaders. But nonetheless, they've had a dramatic impact on that country. I think the price of oil clearly is a detriment to them. And frankly, they haven't been particularly successful of late in other places where their surrogates are engaged in the region. I think that we can't expect that we're going to have one solution that's going to solve all these problems. So back to the first things first. Let's decide what we want for the long term. Can we accept Iran playing some kind of role in this region? If so, how do we get from where we are today to there? At the tactical level, allowing them to get away with instigations and things like they've done in the past in Iraq and Afghanistan, other places, we shouldn't permit. Tactically, I think we act to block those things when we can. The fact that you've got Sunnis and Shias at each other's throats in many places here, something that we're not going to go in and say, okay, guys, sit down, stop this. We're not going to solve it. But I think we act strategically in trying to decide where we want our place to be in a region, and then we work hard against those things that at the tactical level that are real problems. So Iraq today is a real problem. I think to let it just go isn't going to be acceptable. We're going to have to continue to do what we're doing to try to take back the territory that they've lost.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Senator Ernst.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. I certainly appreciate your service on this panel today, as well as your many years of service to the United States. We are very grateful for that. I do agree that we have to have a national security strategy, and this is very important. What we have seen, all of you have mentioned that with sequestration, our effects globally have been diminished. And we are reacting in a knee-jerk way to threats as they come visible. So we don't have an overarching strategy anywhere today. And I think that's a great detriment to all of the citizens here in the United States. But what I'd like to focus on is with what we have seen in Iraq. I served in Iraq from 2003 to 2004 at a very low company level. But we invested so much effort in that region, and we withdrew from that region before many of our military leaders believed we should withdraw. And I do believe we are seeing that in Afghanistan now also. These are areas, especially when it comes to Afghanistan, it's not talked about so much in the media anymore. Again, we seem to focus just on one issue at a time rather than looking at threats globally. With Afghanistan, we see that we have a proposed timeline for withdrawal. And General Keane, you stated that perhaps we won't be ready by 2016 to withdraw our troops. I just sent on Saturday, was at a send-off ceremony for the 361st Medical Logistics Company. They're deploying to Afghanistan, and their mission is to assist in the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. How long, General Keane, do you believe that it will take for us realistically, forget the timeline that's proposed right now, for the Afghan National Security Forces to fill a role and be able to sustain and keep open those lines of communication to maintain security within Afghanistan? Or are we repeating what's happening in Iraq?
Yeah, well, that's a tough question. Listen, I'm very empathetic to American people's frustration, and many of you here in the room today as well. Look at it, we've been at this thing for 13 years. Mm-hmm. And in 13 years, given the United States, you would think we'd be able to resolve this on favorable terms to ourselves and our national interests. Well, it hasn't happened. The facts are, policy decisions drove the 13-year war. It was policy that drove us to a war in Iraq and put Afghanistan on a diet for over 8 years. We never got back to it again until 2009, when the current president made a decision to increase the forces in Afghanistan. But here's the problem we got, Senator. When we increased those forces in Afghanistan, the so-called Afghanistan surge, McChrystal and Petraeus got 25% less than what they needed to do the job. As a result of that, we were never able to apply the surge forces in the eastern part of Afghanistan as we did so successfully in the south. Another policy decision pulled those forces out over the objection of then General Petraeus serving in Afghanistan, in our judgment, prematurely, and no application of surge forces whatsoever dealt with the Haqqani network in the east. The facts are, the Haqqani network is in those safe havens in the east. They're embedded in there, and the Afghan National Security Forces, this is my judgment, does not have the capability currently to be able to deal with that harsh reality. What makes this so serious strategically inside Afghanistan is Kabul's presence to the Haqqani network. Everything that gets lit up in Kabul is done by the Haqqani network. And they are in the environs right now with support infrastructure surrounding Kabul. The only thing that we can do to change that dimension is, one, increase the capacity of the Afghan National Security Forces, and by God, we've got to hold them at 352. Anybody coming to you and telling you that we should put the Afghan National Security Forces on a decline after 2016 is absolutely foolish and irresponsible in that recommendation. So we have to hold at that line, and this Congress has got to fund it. It's got to probably fund it for at least 4 or 5 more years after we pull out of there. Otherwise, we really don't have a chance. Secondly, we have got to step up to what 2 presidents have failed to do, and that is deal with these sanctuaries in Pakistan from which intelligence, support, and training for operations inside Afghanistan comes. This is Afghan Taliban sanctuaries in Pakistan, and specifically, the Haqqani network should be targeted just like al-Qaeda. We will, in targeting them, we will disrupt it, disrupt their command and control, and disrupt their operations. Then we begin to have a chance. Secondly, we cannot pull out our counterterrorism forces at 2016. These are the guys that chase down high-value targets. When we did that in Iraq in 2011, it was a disaster. When al-Qaeda began to rise because we pulled out the intelligence capability to see it, we couldn't see it and we couldn't hit it. If we do that in Afghanistan, I think it's a death knell for Afghanistan. Yes, 13 years is a very long time to be there, but to squander those gains in the face of what we're dealing with makes no sense to me. I don't know how long we would need to keep those troops there. Right now, the plan is to pull them out after 2016. We are talking likely a number around 10,000 troops. Most of them would be in the train, assist, and advise role, which means they're not in combat. A very small portion of them would be in combat, and that is our direct action forces. I think if we educate and explain to the American people what this really is, I think they could possibly support it, and I would hope the Congress of the United States would support it. What drives their departure should be conditions on the ground and our commander's assessment as well.
Thank you. I do agree, and many sacrifices have been made there, and I think that we are falling into those same mistakes. I would rather see us fully engaged and defeat these threats rather than half-step, which is why we need an all-encompassing national security. So thank you, gentlemen, very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Keane.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for the excellent testimony. I heard a lot I agreed with, a lot I disagreed with, and as you say, that's why you're here, to provoke our thinking. It seems that there are 2 very solid points of agreement among the 3 sets of testimony. First, that we are taking a fragmented, reactive approach to global challenges now, and second, that fragmented approach may be driven or at least exacerbated by budgetary dysfunction and indecision here in Washington. You know, ideally, we would have a strategy, and then we would build a budget to support the strategy. Secondarily, we would allow budget to drive strategy, but we've been letting budgetary indecision drive strategy, which is by far the worst thing to do. So I appreciate your comments about both, and I agree with you. I think our approach is a fragmented one, and I think it's exacerbated by budgetary indecision. We had a overarching national security strategy beginning with President Truman deciding to support Greece after World War II, the Truman Doctrine, and it explained a lot of what we did, even things like the creation of the Peace Corps or the race to the moon. You might like the strategy or not, but it was a unified strategy. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we went to a reactive case-by-case. After 9/11, we had a strategy again, which was the war on terror, but over time, that strategy was not a magnanimous enough, big enough strategy for a nation like us, and I think we've devolved after 13 years of war and some fatigue back into the case-by-case approach that is reactive and that is hard for our allies and even our citizens to understand. It seems like in the world now, if you look at an analogy to the post-World War II, it's not a bipolar competition, it's a tripolar one. There are the democracies of the world, led by the United States, but other democracies. India, where the President is visiting now, European nations, South American nations. There are many democracies, and we're the leader. There are the authoritarian nations, with Russia and China chief among them, but North Korea and Iran and other nations in that category. And then there's the jihadists, and the jihadists, some are nations, but many are non-state actors, and that is a new challenge. So the competition today is between democracies, authoritarian regimes, and non-state jihadism. And that makes the challenge of forging a strategy critical. It's difficult, but it's critical, and you've raised important questions for us to grapple with. One of the things I'd like to ask you is, in tackling the jihadism threat that we have, each of you have been active in battling this threat using military means, but I think we all understand that part of the jihadism accelerant is disaffected young people and the allure of young people into a kind of a nihilistic jihadist element because of the lack of their own opportunities. What should we be doing to try to counter the radicalization of young people in the region? How can we assist regional actors and others in doing that so that we can shut off the allure and the foreign fighters that are flocking to groups like ISIL?
Senator, I think that what you have to look at is a definition of the problem that is so rigorous that some of the solutions start coming forward. For example, there are two basic brands of jihadist terrorists. One comes out of Tehran. We know it as Lebanese Hezbollah, declared war on us back in 1983, blew up our embassy in Beirut, blew up the French paratrooper barracks, the Marine barracks, and we've seen them continue to march on, basically unchecked by our counterterrorism efforts. The other brand comes from the Sunni. We know it as al-Qaeda and associated movements. And so as we define these, we don't lump them together. We don't give them any inadvertent support by giving them a cloak of legitimacy. And then we determine if this is not in our best interest, and what is feeding it is not in our best interest, political Islam, then how do we support the countervailing forces? President al-Sisi's speech on the 1st of January at Al-Azhar University, where he said, this has got to end. He's talking to his own clerics now. We've got to quit doing this to the world and dressing it up in the guise of Islam. There are people out there, United Arab Emirates, what we in the military call Little Sparta, because they always stuck with us through everything. Jordan, there are countervailing people in the region, leaders in the region, thought leaders in the region, and we should be fully in support of them. But if we don't define this threat, break it out, identify the countervailing forces, and come up with a strategy that supports exactly what you're talking about, then we'll continue to be spectators as this mutates and grows.
Let me ask you this. I think you all are on the same page on another item, which is, do you all agree that it is a mistake to use a calendar to determine the end date of our Afghanistani involvement rather than an assessment of the conditions on the ground in Afghanistan? Are you all in the same position on that?
Yes,
Admiral?
sir.
Yeah, I'd like to, certainly that's the case.
Right.
But I think we need a little clarity and definition again, just like Jim tried to draw between the Iranian-inspired revolutionary
versus the Sunni
versus disaffected bubbas here who are looking for help. So we talk about withdrawal from Afghanistan, and I saw this, at least from my view, we got into the same morass in Iraq a few years ago. So it was this idea that we're in or we're out. You know, we're going to withdraw, we're not going to withdraw. I think that the reality is our best interests are served not by withdrawing from many places in this world, but for continuing engagement. So what we ought to be talking about is what's already, I believe, put in place. Our major combat engagements have ceased and are not likely to be re-engaged. However, we ought to be continually engaged with them in assisting them in training and supporting them, and in some areas using special forces in areas that we have capabilities and they do not when we see things that challenge our interests. So I think we just need to be clear about this. It isn't just we're in or we're out. We ought to be in my opinion, to do certain things to continue to help this government to move along. And those things are not going to be successful on their own. But if taken in concert with economic steps and political steps by the government, we may have a chance to actually see a long-term good outcome here. But I think it's this clarity and talk. Just stop the, blah, 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 Everybody gets confused. We end up with nothing, and the media just fuels this because they'll pick on the specific word somewhere, and here you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Senator Graham.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed this and gotten a lot out of it, and it's given me a lot to think about, quite frankly. I just regret, to our media friends who are here, thank you for coming. Maybe if we had Tom Brady, we'd fill up the room. But that's the world in which we live in. We're talking about consequential things, and we've got a couple of reporters here. At the end of the day, let's see what we do agree on. This is a generational struggle when it comes to radical Islam, Sunni and Shia. Do you all agree? Somebody will be dealing with this long after most of us are gone. But over time, we win, they lose, right?
If we can come up with a strategy for.
Let me tell you why I think they lose. What they're selling, very few people actually want to buy. The ace in the hole for all of us, ladies and gentlemen, is that the radical Islamic view of life is not embraced by most people in the religion. We just need to provide them the capacity to fight back over there so we can be protected here. Does that make sense? Now, how do you do that? Sequestration, do you all agree that it should be, if not repealed, replaced? All agree. If we don't replace sequestration, our capability to deal with the national security threats you've described is greatly diminished. Is that correct?
Yes.
The enemy is on the rise and our capabilities are going down. Is that a correct assessment? Would you agree that our NATO allies are on a path to reduce their capability, not increase it?
Yes.
So we've got two things going on. We've got the enemy on the rise, we've got America cutting her budget, we've got our NATO allies reducing theirs budgets to help us as partners. Is that a formula for disaster?
Pretty close.
Okay. The 150 account. General Mattis, you said if we cut State Department funding and our developmental accounts under the 150 account, foreign assistance, you'll need more ammunition. Do you still agree with that?
I do, sir. We need a comprehensive approach.
Do you agree with that, General King? Admiral Fallon?
For sure. Can I give you an example? Something?
Sure, please.
Back when I was at CENTCOM, one of my frustrations was an inability to delegate enough time to engage in Central Asia. And what I saw back in those times here about a half dozen years ago was that we had people who were looking for something other than what they had, the Soviet Union. They were concerned about being in a squeeze between resurgent Russia and China, and we were kind of a lifeline. And we had almost no engagement because we didn't have the resources, the interest, the time to devote to things like telling people what things are really like in America. You know, we used to have these
yes, sir.
kind of storefront shops that use diplomatic engagement. That's all disappeared.
I couldn't agree with you more, but Africa, we have a very light military footprint in Africa. Is that correct?
Very much so.
Is a continent very much up in the air in terms of how it will turn out in the 21st century. I just want the members of the committee to know that I'm the chairman of the Foreign Operations Account. And if you think sequestration is bad for the military, you ought to see what it does to our capability to engage the world peacefully. It absolutely destroys it, which is insane. We've on the verge of eradicating malaria. We're making great progress in AIDS and malaria and polio, and all this stuff really does matter in my view. Iraq, General Mattis, how many Marines did we have in the second Battle of Fallujah to retake Fallujah? Do you remember?
In the second battle, sir, it probably would have been somewhere around, including the supporting elements, firing and support, that sort of thing, probably around 10,000.
So we had Army personnel too assisting there, is that correct?
Absolutely. They were significant Army.
So Fallujah is 1/10 the size of Mosul, is that right, General King? Fallujah is about 1/10. How in the world do we go into Mosul? If the past is any indication of the future, if we had 10,000 Marines, and I think it was about 9,000 actually, engaged in helping the Iraqi security forces liberate Fallujah from al-Qaeda in Iraq, who I think is weaker than ISIL, how in the world do we do this in Mosul without a larger American component? Can you envision that being successful without more American help, General Keane?
I don't know for sure. I mean, as I said in my remarks, We are advising, training, and assisting an indigenous force. We made a policy decision not to commit ground combat force to do that. I basically agree with that decision.
I'm not saying that we need, you said we need brigades in the ready in Kuwait.
I believe
you said, you said we needed people on the front lines embedded in Iraqi units. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
What number does that come out to in your mind?
Well, I think we get very close to a number in training and assist and advising, something close to 10,000.
Okay.
And not the few hundred that we're currently doing. I'm talking about frontline advisors with companies and battalions.
I got you, and I got 30 seconds left. So we got 3,000 on the ground today. We need 10,000 in your view. I think that's correct. If we lose in Mosul, if we take ISIL on and lose, that's a bad day for all of us. Do you agree? You got to take these guys on and win. All of you agree? Don't take them on if you can't win. Syria, how many of you support a no-fly zone, a buffer zone to allow the Free Syrian Army?
I do.
General Mattis, no?
Not until we figure out what we want the end state to look like.
Fair enough. Admiral?
No, I've been a part of a 10-year effort in Iraq that ended up being basically wasted.
Okay, let me just ask this simple question. One of the reasons that ISIL was defeated in Kobani, and I want to tip my hat to the Kurds and to our coalition forces, is that you had the Kurds fighting ISIL on the ground and you had American air power. What happens if we send the Free Syrian Army trained up into Syria to fight ISIL and we don't neutralize Assad's air power? Do you not believe that he will engage the Free Syrian Army through the air? How do they survive if he does that?
Well, the facts are he's engaging the Free Syrian Army right now. The Free Syrian Army today on the ground, you know what's so frustrating about this? When the moderate rebels took on Assad's regime back in 2010, do you remember this? They had the momentum. There were many predicting that the regime was about to fall. What happened? What happened? This is what happened. The Iranians jumped in with 5,000 Hezbollah out of Lebanon. They jumped in with 3,000 Quds force, plus their top leaders, on the ground to assist, and Russian airplanes flying in with Iranian airplanes with military supplies. Every single day, the Free Syrian Army came to us, the momentum shifted, and they said, what? And many of you were on their dance card when they came to town here. Even I was on it, as probably my two colleagues. What did they want? They wanted simply this. We need arms to be able to stop his tank systems and anti-aircraft systems to shoot down his airplanes. We don't need your troops. We don't even need your air power. Let us fight this war ourselves. We think we can win it. And we said no. We have never recovered from that decision. That decision was revisited again with strong feelings by Petraeus, Clinton, Panetta, and Dempsey in 2012. Took it to the White House, said this is what we got to do. Petraeus vetted that force as a CIA director. The president said no. We have never recovered from that decision.
I think we may have missed the opportunity to work with the Free Syrian Army. They've been ground down between al-Nusra and ISIS on one side, Assad on the other. We're going to have to really look at what options we have, sir.
The only comment I'd make is that we can sit here and wring our hands and bemoan the past in lots of situations. We need to deal with the present. So for now, forget the past except for lessons learned for new strategies, but we need to figure out what it's going to take right now to move forward.
Well, let me tell you what I think the present is that Syria and Iraq are great platforms to attack the United States. And if we keep screwing around with this and these guys get stronger in a year from now, they're still in place, we're going to get hit. It's time to put these guys on the run with a regional force that we complement. Because let me tell you about the end game, General Mattis. The end game is America's going to get attacked if we don't deal with the threat in Iraq and Syria. Do you agree with that?
100%, sir.
Thank you.
Senator Donnelly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank all of you for your extraordinary service. We are so much in your debt. And America has already been attacked in that we have lost a number of our young people already to ISIL, tragically in my home state. And they've said they're a caliphate, which means they either grow or they go. And in Iraq, I would like to get your best ideas, General Keane. You're really influential in working with the Sunni community there and in trying to push back before. How do we coordinate with them, work with them to push ISIS out of Iraq and then to get them in Syria? And then I'd like to obviously hear from General Mattis and Admiral Fallon because of your hard work on this as well.
Well, you know, when you think about the Sunnis, I mean, the Sunni tribes are not a homogeneous organization, to say the least, and all of us are very familiar with it at this table.
Right.
So we have irreconcilable Sunni tribes. Many of them are part of the former Saddam Hussein regime elements who are fighting with ISIS, and they will continue to fight with ISIS. The rest of them, by and large, are reconcilable. And what happened before in Iraq informs of this when they pushed back against al-Qaeda, beginning in Anbar province and moved into Diyala province and other places where Sunnis lived. They know they have made a bed with strange fellows here. They know that it's not in their interest to support the long-term objective of ISIS, which ISIS wants to govern the populations it controls and impose 7th century Talibanism on it. Right now, in Mosul, this is what life is like. All universities and school systems are shut down. The only schools that are operating are the madrasas indoctrinating radical Islamist ISIS beliefs, and a medical school that they're forcing students into to become doctors to take care of their wounded. Second, they do not run government services very well. Garbage is on the streets. Other government services aren't provided. The people in Mosul are not recreating at all. They're not even socializing with extended family members who don't live in their immediate vicinity. Life as they knew it, teeming marketplaces, traffic jams, a thriving community is gone.
So how would you push them?
So what we know,
and I apologize if you're already
we know that exists. We know that ISIS and reconcilable Sunnis are on a collision course. What we have to do is incentivize them more than what we are doing now, to get at your question. One of the things we can do, obviously a body is key to this, as Admiral Fallon laid out, and I strongly support that. Secondly, we need to go into Anbar province, and we have some plans for this, to train and arm the Sunni tribes. But we got to take another step with that. We got to be willing to be on the ground with them when they take the fight to ISIS. We need advisors with them. We need people to help coordinate fire support and close air support with them. That will incentivize them. We need to help to accelerate that timetable for them. The thing that we have working for us, again, to emphasize this, is ISIS itself. But here's the problem we have. The political leadership in Iraq does not want to wait, because the pressure they have on them from the people in Mosul and the conditions that I'm describing to you are very real, and they are accountable to those conditions. They want to go faster. The United States is pulling back and saying we're not ready. The military in Iraq wants to go faster because it's answering to its national leadership. We're not ready to do this yet. I'm not certain we're going to be ready to do it by the summer. And the reason is we're not applying enough resources to it, Senator.
I was just going to ask you, are we not ready because we don't have the ability to do it, or because we don't have the plan to do what's necessary?
Well, mostly I believe, listen, we can craft a counteroffensive plan to take back Mosul and also to take back Anbar province. We know how to do that. That's tacking up the two great biblical river valleys. Most of this is about resources and dealing with what most of us believe is a relatively weak indigenous hand on the ground that we're playing. If you got a weak hand, then we should be strengthening that hand, not with the minimum amount of resources, but with all the resources it takes to strengthen that hand. And we're not doing that.
Well, here's my fear, is that this is a hotbed. This is where they are communicating with people in our country to attack us, in Syria and in Iraq and with ISIS. And if we have resources, they ought to be used in this area. It seems to me that we either eliminate them or there's going to be a catastrophe in our own country. I would like to hear what you think about how we start to go on the move in Syria as well. General Mattis?
Senator, the first thing, we don't lack military capability. It's been sequestration has stressed it. What we lack is the political will and the definition of the political end state. If we figure out whose side we're on here, then when you look at what Maliki did to break trust with those tribes, I think the new Prime Minister has probably got a 50-50 chance of restoring that trust. It's hard. Putting in the Sunni Minister of Defense was a great step, I think. But we're going to have to decide what the end state is, and then we're going to have to commit resources that we've not committed yet.
I am out of time, but I just want to thank all of you for coming here today, for continuing your service, because the people of our country continue to need your help. Thank you very much.
Senator Sullivan.
I also want to thank you, gentlemen, for being here today, your great service, tremendous service to our country. So I think there's broad agreement. This seems certainly among the three of you, I think among all the panelists here, on the importance of a comprehensive strategy that integrates all elements of American power, all of our resources. And we've talked about economic, we've talked about diplomatic, we've talked about finance. Certainly we are focused on military. One instrument of American power, though, that we haven't really discussed, hasn't really come up in the conversations yet, and maybe it's because 10 years ago it didn't exist as an instrument of power, is American energy. As you know, we are once again on the verge, if we haven't already gotten there, on being the world's energy superpower, a position that we used to occupy several decades ago, and now we're back. Oil, gas, renewables. And from the perspective of dealing with long-term national security threats, whether it's Iran, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, whether it's ISIS, I just want to start with two questions for you, General Keane. How critical and beneficial do you think it is in dealing with these longer-term threats that we now have a tremendous resource in America, which is energy, that not only for our own citizens, but that we can be exporting to our allies? And do you think it undermines America's security when we undertake policies, as the current administration does on a regular basis? This weekend is another example where we undermine policies that enable us to responsibly develop our own energy resources that can benefit us as a nation and our national security.
Well, certainly, energy independence for the United States and the rapid growth that's taken place, most recently, is certainly an added measure of our national security, and delighted to see it. And my own view of it, I'm not an energy expert, is that certainly we should do whatever we can to ensure that independence, and I'm convinced we can still protect the environment while we're doing it. Its relationship to the world is significant. I mean, you hit on it. Europeans are tied like an umbilical cord to Putin and Russia because of the energy dependence. We can help with that if we changed our policies in terms of particularly exporting natural gas, as you know. But also, we have to be realistic. Radical Islam and what is taking place in these countries laid out on this map is a fundamental geopolitical movement, and they're operating in countries where there are not democracies and where there are significant conditions that are providing a groundswell for this kind of activity. They would be doing that regardless of Saudi oil or not. We got to understand that. So if we pull the plug on any dependence in the Middle East on oil, which we're on the way to doing, it doesn't change the harsh reality of Iran's march to regional domination and radical Islamist march to geopolitical control of Muslim countries. That's still there, and that threat to Europe and to the United States as a result of it would exist regardless.
Thank you. I'd like to move from the strategic to the tactical. I've had the honor the last 18 months as serving as a commanding officer of 6 Anglico in the Marine Corps Forces Reserves. In fact, I was just out with some of my Anglico Marines, Fort Lewis, Washington, this past weekend. General Mattis, the Marines of 6 Anglico, send their greetings. As you know, that mission is of the Anglico units is to deploy in small forces with foreign armies, call in airstrikes, other supporting arms. General Mattis, this question is for you. To make progress on the ground against ISIL, is there any scenario that you could see that would not include integrated supporting arms firepower? And are there foreign forces that can do that, or is that something that is an area that is pretty much needed to have American troops, whether Anglico units or special forces units, doing that kind of mission?
Senator, there are other forces, the Australians, Canadians, British, French, that can do the close air coordination integration, but no one has the capacity or probably the frequency of training that permits us to do it best. I would only suggest that as you look at this and the kind of forces that can work with allies, this committee should prioritize them, whether they be the Army Green Berets, the Marines Anglico, and even to the point of looking at our Army brigades today, our Marine battalions, differently than we looked at them as just conventional war fighters 10 years ago. They have capability to do much of this and to give a kind of steel the spine of the Allied forces if we have the political will to put them in.
Great. Thank you very much.
Senator Hirono.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I want to thank all 3 of you for your very substantive and provocative testimony. General Keane, you described life in Mosul, where schools are just set up to radicalize the population, where just everyday life has changed, and one wonders how long ISIL can so-called govern in this way. So you're indicating that we, the United States, should have people on the ground, not boots on the ground, when the people in Iraq finally get to the point where they want to fight ISIL. Now, the question becomes then, when is that time? And would you say that that is perhaps a major role for our intelligence community to inform us as to when that critical point is that we need to be there to help the people fight back? And I'd also like to ask that question of General Keane, because, General Keane, you noted the importance of our intelligence community in establishing priorities.
Yeah, listen, that's a very tough question, Senator. The only thing I can, in helping you with that, is just look back a little bit. We had an insurgency begin in Iraq in the spring and summer of 2003. The Al-Qaeda, led by Saddam Hussein and his people, the Al-Qaeda fell in on that very quickly. And then in 2006, some 2.5, 3 years later, Sunni tribes who were aligned with them initially, began to push back. And much of it was literally driven by women, frankly, because the women were putting pressure on the tribal leaders that they did not want their children and their grandchildren to live like this for generations to come, with 7th century Talibanism under the foot of what Al-Qaeda was doing, controlling every aspect of their life, from diet to costume, behavior, Sharia law, etc. That frustration is already there. I do believe that, given the fact that, particularly in Anbar province, this has existed before, the accelerant will be faster and not take 3 years. I'm going to make an assumption that our intelligence community, with the use of informants and others, are monitoring what is taking place, and we have some sense of what the conditions are, and more importantly, what the attitude and behavior are of the people themselves. But let's also be honest that there's just so much those people in Mosul will be able to do against a well-armed and well-equipped force as ISIS is in Mosul and in its suburbs. To eject them out of there will take a conventional military force to do that, supported by air power and some pretty good intelligence on where people are. The attitude and support of the people will be a factor, but I don't believe in of itself it will be decisive. What will be decisive is the use of military force to defeat that military organization that's there.
And the conventional military force should be the Iraqi military themselves, with
yes,
possible air support
yes,
from
very much so.
our allies.
Well, it's Peshmerga, as you know, who is the militia from Kurdistan, who have the will to fight and the skill. They don't have all the weapons they need. Iraqi army, and by the way, the Iraqi army probably is in a little bit better shape based on some recent reports I just got this weekend from people who returned than many of the media reports are suggesting. But secondly, and thirdly would be the Sunni tribes. Now, the Shia militia are part of this, and they have strengthened the Iraqi army very considerably. The best fighters in the Shia militia are Iranian-backed Shia militia.
General, I'm sorry to cut you off.
Go ahead. I'll stop.
I have a couple of other questions, particularly with reference to the rebalance to the Asia-Pacific. And General Mattis, I think you indicated in your testimony the importance of the Navy, and clearly, Admiral Fallon, you have familiarity with what's going on in the Asia-Pacific area because of your previous position. So the Navy is intending to put 60% of our ships in the Asia-Pacific area. So for the two of you, I'd like to know, well, how is this viewed by China? How is this kind of a resource placement due to our rebalance seen by our allies and by our enemies? Just very briefly, if you please comment.
Senator, I think very briefly, this is a little bit speculative now. I think 60% of too few is probably still too few. But I think that anything we can do to reassure our allies that their economic, territorial future is not going to be under the veto of the Chinese would be welcome out in the Pacific.
Admiral Fallon.
Aloha, Senator.
Aloha.
I think this whole discussion of the pivot has been distorted and not handled particularly well at all. So just a couple of facts. So 60% versus 50%, which is what we in the Navy, and we'll just stick to the Navy now, the Navy was pretty well split 50-50 during the Cold War. As soon as the Cold War ended, internal Navy leadership started to press to rebalance way before this became a recent political slogan, and because it made sense, because of the vast size of the Pacific and so forth. But that 10%, if you just take one denomination, aircraft carriers, that's one aircraft carrier based on today's fleet. And by the way, that carrier is already in the Pacific. So much of this is just chatter, pretty mindless. Again, take another measure, the entire fleet of 280 ships, 10% of that's 28. So what are we really talking about? Not a whole lot. But the perceptions are all over the place. And depending on who you are and in what country you are in Asia, if you're Chinese, you use this as a great example to see, we knew that you guys are coming to encircle us, it's yet another blah, 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 and a justification in some respects for them to push to increase their military capabilities. So I think it's overblown. The reality is we need to be engaged in the Far East, in the Asia-Pacific, and given the size and scope of the place, it makes all the sense in the world to have our fleet tilted that way, given the realities in the world. We need to work very closely with our long-term allies out there, the Japanese, the Australians, and others, and those that support us. But at the same time, we have got to work this difficult task of trying to figure out how we collaborate in ways that make sense with the Chinese for the long term. It's a huge country, huge impact, blah, blah, blah. You know the impact economically in this country. And so we don't need to have another Cold War. We don't need to have another road to conflict with these guys. We have very interesting, deep relationships in every aspect except the military to military. That's where the emphasis needs to be. I think our leadership, particularly the military leadership in our country, is working this right now, and we need to continue it.
Thank you very much. My time is up.
Senator Tillis.
Gentlemen, thank you for your leadership and your extraordinary record of service. General Mattis, you made a comment that we seem to be at about a low point with our Middle East policy or effectiveness over the last 4 decades. Can you point to anything, say, over the last 6 or 8 years that you think is something positive that we've done that we should build on, and in the context of the number of things that you've said that are not working?
Yes, sir, I can. We've been somewhat in a strategy-free environment for quite some time. It didn't start with this administration. And so we've been wandering. We have policies that go on and come off. But I think if you were to look at the fact that Maliki was pushed out of office with our full support there inside Baghdad, I think that was a positive step. We cannot get Iraq to fight this enemy when they have a prime minister who's basically declared Kurds and Sunni persona non grata in their own country. I think the engagement, the president going to Saudi Arabia as we speak, is certainly a positive point. You know, I'd have to think more, Senator, but I'll take it for the record. If I think of something more, I'll get back to you. We've disappointed a lot of friends out there from Tel Aviv to Riyadh, from Abu Dhabi to Cairo.
General Keane, you mentioned the need to equate, I think, radical Islamists to Nazis and communists of the past. Why do you think it's important to use those words, and why do you think it's dangerous not to?
Well, I use it because it's something we coped with in the past rather successfully, and they were ideologies themselves, you know, that another generation had to deal with. We beat Nazism with brute force, and I think communist ideology, to express it simplistically, it's only more sophisticated than that, but simplistically I think we beat it with better ideas. And I think it's the combination of both of those that we need to deal with radical Islam. We obviously need to use force, but that alone will not solve this problem. And the ideology also has to be dealt with. After all, what they are running from and why they do not want the United States in the region, it's not just because of our guns. It's because of our ideas. It's democracy and capitalism that is an anathema to them. And they don't want our ideas polluting those governments that they're attempting to overthrow so that they move in a direction of those ideas. So that's why I use that, because we want to run from the ideological aspect of this thing, and you have to face it, and you have to explain it, and you have to undermine it, and you have to counter it.
Admiral Fallon.
Senator, I think that one of the problems today with this radical jihadist stuff is that we give it unmerited credibility. I don't view this problem in the same context as I view, for example, the need to make sure this country is fundamentally sound in its political, economic, and other aspects going forward for our future. Nor do I think that it's in the same relative merit as our long-term relationship with China. And the extent to which we hype everything that seems to happen with these characters, I think, is one of the reasons why they're attractive to the disenfranchised and the folks who are struggling in other countries that see this as a chance to gain glory and go help out the crusade. So I think we'd be well served to try to tamp this stuff down, This army, if you would, in Iraq and Syria is certainly not the 82nd Airborne or the 1st Marine Division by any means. It's a pickup band of jihadists that share blah, blah, blah. We've gone through that. They are not in the same league with our capabilities, and I think the extent to which we continue to hype them is really counterproductive to what we're doing, or what we should be doing.
Thank you. There's been a lot of discussion in the Middle East. Some of you touched in your opening statements on Russia's incursions. What more attention should we focus on, and what should we expect, if you had a crystal ball, to see in the Ukraine and other areas in that region if we don't act? What specific steps should we be taking beyond what we've done to send the message? We talked about economic actions, but other actions to send the message to the Russians that what they're doing is unacceptable and that we're better positioned to react to them.
Well, I mentioned some of those in my remarks. I think we have to admit that to ourselves that our diplomatic efforts using sanctions as the mainstream have certainly not dissuaded Putin from what he's attempting to achieve, what I think is a new political order in Eastern Europe post-Cold War. You know, whether he's a strategic thinker or a tactical thinker and he's impulsive and he reacts to sort of current events, I think is beside the point. I don't think we should waste a lot of time about that. I mean, the fact of the matter is he is acting, and he has taken advantage of the situation. It is a huge opportunity for him. He senses that Europe has feckless leadership and is probably not going to respond, and he also puts the United States in that category, and he's advantaging himself as a result of it. What do we have to do? We have to convince him that we're serious, that NATO really matters to us, that Eastern Europe does really matter to us. Otherwise, I think he keeps coming. And certainly we want to avoid a military conflict with him, and I think there are steps that we can prudently take to do that. One is what was discussed before about helping with energy and removing some of the energy dependence that the Europeans have on them. But secondly, listen, the threat has shifted. So we have a threat in Eastern Europe on NATO's eastern flank. Let's shift NATO forces to that area, not just temporarily in and out, but let's put some permanent bases there and demonstrate to him that Article 5 really does matter. I'm absolutely convinced in his conference room, he has people sitting around a table with him saying, do we really believe that Angela Merkel will respond to a threat that we impose with disguised soldiers in Estonia? And they're answering that question. But we don't want that question on a table. We want to take that question off the table. And I think we can do that. Now, whether we put the missile defense back into where we took it out at the beginning of this administration, I think that needs to be relooked. I'm not confident that that was all right to begin with, dealing with what that threat was. It was the Iranian ballistic missile threat. So I think that needs to be relooked in terms of where we place it. But certainly, it is a disgrace that we have been able to provide arms to the Ukrainians who want to push back and have a history of courageous military interaction to protect their own people. They're not asking for anything else. They're not asking for our troops. They're not asking for air power. All they wanted was some weapons, and we've stiffed them on it. Makes no sense to me whatsoever. What a message that says to Putin. It's not surprising he's on the move again in eastern Ukraine. That our diplomatic efforts have not worked because they don't have anything behind it. We need to put some things on the table that will strengthen our diplomatic efforts, and we haven't been doing that.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Manchin.
Thank you very much, and let me thank all three of you for your service, but more importantly for the testimonies you've given today. You've been very frank and direct. I think that what General Fallon said, Admiral Fallon said, that basically is we have to deal with the future and what we're doing today and what we're going to do in the future. But hindsight being 20/20, you know, you look at the all-volunteer military that we have today. I run into an awful lot of people in our little state of West Virginia who have served because they were drafted or because they enlisted, but they were serving. Today, that's less likely with a volunteer. And they all believe that if we'd had some intermingling of a volunteer versus a draft, that we wouldn't have had a 13-year war. We'd have had better decisions, better direction, if you will, because the people would have demanded it. Hindsight being 20/20, I get this question asked a lot. We took out Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Should we have ever entered Iraq? Should we declared war on Iraq? Then we went in and took him out. Is Iraq better, safer than it was before? Gaddafi, we took Gaddafi out. Is Libya in better shape than it was before? And now we're in this thrones of Syria. What do we do in Syria? Do we take out Assad? And what will that leave in Syria? Also, we're going to be dealing with the fact, do we sign on with the sanctions of Iran, double down? Do we give the president the ability to negotiate up to March 24th, then double down? And you all have been forthright with some of your comments, and I'd love to know what you think about, first of all, Iraq. Should we or should we have not? Should we in Syria? And how much effect do you think we'll have trying to find people that will fight ISIL, then turn and fight Assad? And our commitment, as I'm understanding, the Saudis and the Turks and everybody else want us to commit to fighting and taking out Assad if they're going to help us fight and take out ISIL. So with that, I'll open the door and see where you all go with it. And we'll just start down the road, down the aisle. We'll start with you, Admiral Fallon, first.
Well, Senator, I would not go back and speculate on the merits of how good or how bad each of those decisions were based on where we are, except to say that...
Well, the reason I've asked that, sir, is because we have to make a decision. Syria is close to making that same decision. Do you learn from whatever we've done? Okay.
So I think the lesson I would take is, okay, we made a decision, and where are we now?
Gotcha.
And, you know, what are the chances that we're going to be in a different place if we take a similar decision, whatever. But I'd like to go back, if I could, to your opening comment, because I think it's the most important thing to me, that maybe not the most important, the thing that concerns me the most for the long term as I look at our country and our ability to address national security issues and the future health of this nation. That is the very, very small percentage of this population that is in any way, shape, or form actively engaged with the uniformed services. So we had a lot of rhetoric in the last half dozen years or so about this, but as we go forward, what I see that really concerns me is that there's a growing gap between the few that are actively engaged in this, and I get the feeling that a lot of people kind of think that it's a job, this is their job, they're going to go fight this thing. So is that what we really want to have in this country? And do you think we're going to make better decisions if we have that view that we have this paid professional army that goes off and takes care of business while everybody else does their own thing? I think that's a huge problem, and we ignore it at our peril. Thank you.
General Keane.
Yeah. Starting with the all-volunteer force, I served as Jim and Fox did also in a draft military and transitioned to a volunteer force post-Vietnam. And as a result of that, I think by anybody's judgment, that force is probably the best this country's ever put together. And there's nothing quite like it anyplace else in the world. I attribute that to a couple of reasons. One, the force looks like America in its diversity, ethnicity, etc. And two, they want to be there, and they want to accept the burden and the responsibility that goes with it. In that draft military, we had so many there that didn't want to be there. It was frustrating to deal with them. We did a lot of social rehabilitation for people. I don't believe that's what a global power is about, frankly. I think the skills that are needed of the military today, it's a prerequisite that we have the kind of people in the organization that are willing to make the sacrifice. I accept what Fox is saying. I have similar concerns. 1% are involved. and we've grown apart from the American people as a result of a volunteer force. But nonetheless, I don't think going back to revisit the draft and conscription is the answer to that. Secondly, on Iraq and Syria, Iraq itself, I was a four-star at the time. I didn't think we should. Well, I was shocked that in the first week in December of 2001, we had made the decision to go to war in Iraq. Just after we toppled the Taliban, I was asking the question, why, and when, et cetera. I could see the need for it at some point, certainly, because of the WMD issue, but my view at that time was to stay on top of the al-Qaeda, which was the reason we were in Afghanistan, and run these guys into every hole that they're in till we get rid of them. That's kind of where I was. And if that meant dealing with Pakistan and their resistance, so what? But after what took place here, that was my motivation. In Syria, listen, Syria is as complex a thing as we've had on our plate. And you can be on any side of this issue and make reasonable sense. The only thing that concerns me about this, and I respect Jim when he says, I want to know what the political end state is. I think what we try to achieve in Syria is Assad goes, some form of that government stays in partnership with moderate forces to help run that country. So you're looking towards a political solution. But I just know that we're on a collision course that right now in Syria, with ISIS expanding control and dominance inside the country, at the same time we're trying to push back on them with our ground forces that's being pounded by the Assad regime. And if we continue to let that happen, the Free Syrian Army and the force that we're trying to support is going to go away. And that's the reality of it. Do you do something about that? Do you try to make some attempts to do that? Dealing with all of the geopolitical complications that entails? My answer to that is yes. I think we should try. And listen, it is hard. I'm not suggesting it's not. But like most human endeavors, it's not hopeless either.
Madam Chair, may I just indulge and ask General Mattis if he would, on the volunteer versus the...
Yes, sir. Sir, I think the volunteer force has been good for the military. I think it's been bad for the country. I would only add on the decision to invade a country, to go into I don't know what our policy is on Syria. I don't know what the political end state is that people want to accomplish. And if you wander into a war without knowing that, you're probably going to get lost on your way to somewhere. I would just tell you that we should never go into these countries unless we have a reasonable chance of a better outcome. And war is fundamentally unpredictable, so that means a long-term commitment with a clear political end state and a fully resourced, sound strategy to get there. And otherwise, don't go in and then look at Libya in your rearview mirrors anywhere else and wonder what you've done.
Thank you,
Senator, I don't want to leave this with the impression that I endorse the return to conscription. I don't at all. But I think that we ought to be seriously considering how we motivate people for service in this country, not just in the military, but on a range of things. But the way we're headed right now causes me a lot of concern.
I keep thinking there can be a blend between the volunteer that we have now with a pool of draft, if you will, or...
If we had an atmosphere in which we encourage service in this country, I think we'd have no difficulty filling the ranks of the armed forces with people that would volunteer, if that were the mindset of the majority of the people in this country.
Well, people just said that basically if we had an all volunteer Army during Vietnam, we'd still be in Vietnam.
Senator King.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Somebody asked me up in Maine recently what my job consisted of, and I thought for a minute, and I said it's applied history with a minor in communications. And your testimony today has been ample evidence that this is really all about history. And I've got a lot of favorite quotes from Mark Twain, but my all-time favorite is that history doesn't always repeat itself, but it usually rhymes. And that's what we're talking about here today. Talking about history, would you all agree, and I don't need lengthy answers, that leaving Afghanistan prematurely would be a major strategic mistake for this country.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Admiral Fallon, you agree? To me, it's given all the progress, and I don't think the American people realize the amount of progress that's been made in Afghanistan in terms of the lives of the people. It's fumbling the ball on the 5-yard line, and a modest additional commitment in terms of people and treasure would maintain those benefits. And I think, General Keane, you testified without that, it's lost.
So I think one of our problems, the legacy in Afghanistan, is that we've already done this twice, been there and bailed out, and there's a lot of concern that we could do it again.
Well, particularly when we finally have a leader in the country that we can work with and has some hope of real political leadership in the country. Second question, I couldn't help but hear echoes, General Keane, particularly in your testimony. We're talking about ISIS, we're talking about radical Islam, and all the language could be applied to the communists in the 40s and 50s. A radical ideology that was bent on world domination, putting America out of business, all of those kinds of things. The strategy then was essentially containment. We never invaded Russia. We didn't have direct military confrontation, but George Kennan's famous strategy was containment until eventually it imploded because its ideas weren't as good as ours. Isn't that a guide anyway for a strategy with regard to this threat that we're facing today?
Well, I definitely agree with a broad strategy and the political and military alliances that we formed to deal with it. But the facts are, this movement has attacked us, and it's crushing our interests in the region as well by physical means. So that has changed the dimension of it quite a bit.
Senator, I think that in a globalized world today, where we're perhaps one airline seat away from somebody exporting this right into Paris or wherever else, we have to be very, very careful thinking that we can contain this without having ramifications on our economy, on our friends. For example, we may be energy independent in North America, or will be very soon, but the global price of oil on a globally traded commodity will be set out of the Middle East. The world's economy would immediately impact from Maine to California if it got, the oil cut off there. The fact that we are oil independent, energy independent, would not change. So the idea we could contain this in that region and let all hell break loose there, I don't think that would work in this case. Even though I do agree with you that the internal contradictions inside communism and the internal contradictions inside political Islamic jihadist thinking will rot them from the inside out, just like with the communists.
But I think you're right. Where the historic parallel breaks down is the non-state actor piece of this, and also communications. And I think you mentioned 7th century. I don't know which century it is, but the danger we're in now is that we're dealing with people with 7th century ethics and 21st century weapons. It strikes me that intelligence is absolutely one of the key elements in this battle, perhaps more so than ever. Let me conclude with a couple of questions about Iran. We're engaged in this negotiation that's going to come to some kind of conclusion, we believe, in the next 2 or 3 months. I don't think there's much likelihood of an additional extension. What if those negotiations fail? What are our next steps if we end up with either no deal or a deal that is just not acceptable in terms of containing Iran's ambitions?
Senator, we have to limit their ability to enrich fuel. That's critical, and we have to have a rigorous inspection regime that ensures that we have confidence in it, knowing the denial and deceit they've used to hide this weapons program in the past. If it fails, I think we would have to re-energize and elevate the economic sanctions, perhaps even to the point of a blockade, and then we should move strongly against the situation with Lebanese Hezbollah and Syria. I think that a defeat of Iranian interests in that area could reverberate right back into Tehran, and the Iranian people would be in a position, like with the Green Revolution, perhaps to come out in the streets. But the oppressive powers are strong, and the alternative to the economic and some of these peripheral efforts working would be would probably end up being war.
It was interesting. I was just in the Middle East last weekend and talking with people in the Gulf states. It was interesting to me, again, in history, we know that we're dealing in some ways with an ancient civil war between Sunnis and Shiites, but the Gulf states are very worried about Iran's expansionism, even outside of the nuclear area. And we're now talking about an ancient civil war between Persians and Arabs. I think many people don't realize that Iranians are not Arabs, and that this goes back to Darius. I mean, in some ways, you've got people trying to recreate the Ottoman Empire, and other people trying to create the Persian Empire. And here we are trying to wend our way through 2,000-year-old disputes. That's not really a question, but General Keane, your thoughts?
Well, I think our behavior with Iran through the years has been pretty atrocious. Frankly, they bombed our Marine barracks, as Jim mentioned, using proxies. They took down our embassy in Lebanon. They took down the annex. They took down the Kuwait embassy. They took down Air Force barracks in Khobar Towers. General Lloyd Austin, who commands CENTCOM, believes that Iranian trained militia by battalion commanders and from Hezbollah, who did it at 2 training bases in Iran, we knew where those bases were, are responsible for killing close to 2,000 of the 4,400 Americans killed in Iraq, because they developed an IED exclusively to be used only against Americans, not against Iraqi military and not against Iraqi people. These are the things that we have already accepted. Not a single Republican or Democratic president has ever counted any of that.
Yeah, I was going to make the point that it's a nonpartisan non-response. A bipartisan non-response.
It is a bipartisan non-response. So here we go into negotiations by a regime whose stated objective is to dominate the region. They are beginning to do that, and they want nuclear weapons to guarantee their preservation and also to help in their geopolitical objectives. The beginning of these negotiations, we've already given up too much. We're permitting highly enriched uranium and thousands of centrifuges as the going-in deal. We're already behind. The only negotiation that should have been done was dismantle the program and we'll take off the sanctions. But that's not where we are. So I believe if it fails, we go back to tough, crippling economic sanctions, bring in the National Security Agency, have the director there lay down in front of them what they could do to get after Iran to change its behavior. We're on a collision course with them. I don't agree with Fox. Then we can sit down and have more dialogue with these guys, and somehow we'll work towards mutual interests in the region when their stated interests are truly regional domination, and we have already given up too much to them as we speak.
Thank you. I want to thank these gentlemen, Madam Chair. This has been one of the most informative, provocative, and I think helpful hearings that I've participated in since I've been here. Thank you so much for your direct and honest testimony. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I couldn't agree more with what Senator King just said, and appreciate all of you. I think we've got a couple of second-round questions, and appreciate all of you staying here. I wanted to follow up, General Mattis, on testimony that you gave about our detention policy. You had said we've observed the perplexing lack of detainee policy that has resulted in the return of released prisoners to the battlefield. We should not engage in another fight without resolving this issue up front, treating hostile forces, in fact, as hostile. Could you help us understand what are the consequences of a lack of detention policy in terms of our national security? And as I count it, we know we've confirmed at least 107 terrorists that were formerly detained at Guantanamo have now been confirmed to have reengaged in terrorist activity, and an additional 77 are suspected of doing so. So what are the implications of this lack of detention policy? Why does it matter to us? And also, what does it impact us in terms of gathering intelligence as it relates to interrogation policy?
Ma'am, the implication first and foremost, I believe, is that we go into a fight and we're not even certain of ourselves enough to hold as prisoners the people that we've taken in the fight. For example, in 1944, we didn't take Rommel's troops who were in POW camps in Texas and let them go back and get another shot at us at Normandy. We kept them until the war was over. We didn't start this war, and if an enemy wants to fight or be a truck driver, we didn't say his radio operators could be released because they didn't have a significant role. If you sign up with this enemy, they should know we're coming after you if the President, the Commander-in-Chief, sends us out there. And if taken prisoner, you'll be prisoner until the war is over. I mean, this is not warfighting 301 or advanced warfighting. This is kind of 101, ma'am. The biggest concern I have, having been in the infantry for many years, if our troops find that they are taking someone prisoner a second time, and they have just scraped one of their buddies off the pavement and zipped him into a bag, the potential for maintaining the ethical imperative we expect of our armed forces is going to be undercut if, in fact, the integrity of our war effort does not take those people off the battlefield permanently if taken prisoner. In other words, they will take things into their own hands under the pressures of warfare. So I think that what we have to do is have a repeatable detainee policy so that when we take them, we hold them, and there's no confusion about their future, not among the enemy's minds, certainly not among our own. I would go by the Geneva Convention and maintain them with Red Cross oversight until the war was over.
Thank you, General. I wanted to follow up. Let me just say, General Keane, I fully agree with what you have said about providing defensive arms to Ukraine. I think that it absolutely is a disgrace, and I can't understand why this administration has not provided these arms so that they can defend themselves against Russian aggression, and I think we're sending the wrong message there. And I think the other consideration for all of us in this is, in signing the Budapest Memorandum, why would any nation, again, give up its nuclear weapons when we won't provide basic defensive arms when they are faced with aggression on their own territory? And I would like you to comment on, what are the implications of that as we ask, for example, other nations to give up their nuclear weapons? I don't understand why they would do it when they see our behavior here.
Well, I totally agree. I mean, we went back on an agreement. We went back on our word. I believe that's one of the reasons that Putin is looking at NATO itself, and he's saying to himself, is this still the organization that helped force the collapse of the Soviet Union back in '91? Or has this organization lost its moral fiber? So I think when we break agreements like that, even though Ukraine was not a member of NATO, clearly the deal that was made was in their interest as well as the world's interest. And we foreclosed on it, and shame on us, for doing that. And I do believe it has significant implications, not just to other countries who we believe are our friends, but because it does embolden and encourage Vladimir Putin. I mean, common sense tells you it does, and his behavior certainly underscores that.
I wanted to follow up on the discussion on Iran and looking at their behavior. I think, General Keane, you had said that we're already behind on this deal in terms of what we've agreed to. So as we look at the negotiations that are going on, what does a good deal look like? And given the implications of this for our national security, I firmly believe that Congress should have a say in that agreement and what is the result. But what does a good deal look like? One that we can ensure that they can't immediately gear up their nuclear weapons program again. And finally, I don't see in any of these negotiations any resolution whatsoever to their missile program. They're seeking ICBM capability that obviously can hit our East Coast, and also their activities as the largest state sponsor of terrorism. So can you help us understand what should we be looking for, and what about those two other issues that I think are very important to us as well in terms of their activities?
Well, as I've said, I don't think there is a good deal here at all, because what we're arguing over is the technology that will drive the time to develop a weapon. So our negotiators are trying to pull out some of those technologies to extend the amount of time it will take to develop a weapon. But we've been in this dance step before with the Iranians going back 15 years in these negotiations, and it's always 2 steps forwards and 1 step back. And that's where we are. I have absolutely no confidence that if we made a deal, that the Iranians will not undermine that and move fast forward to be able to develop a nuclear weapons much faster than what we think. And I think history is on the side of that argument, frankly. So I am not optimistic at all about this. I will give the administration credit for well-intentioned motivations, because I don't want to get into that. And I can't, because you have to get into people's heads. But the fact of the matter is, we should be very concerned about a bad deal here, because I believe we're on the path to it. Let's be honest with ourselves. This regime the supreme leader is not giving up on having a nuclear weapon. Anybody that thinks that is incredibly delusional and naive. He is on a path to it. He will achieve it. He has got in charge now, not Ahmadinejad, who most people had no respect for, even inside his own country. He has got a sophisticated leader that is working this very well to achieve his objectives geopolitically, and I believe he's on that path. So I'm not confident at all. And the only deal that makes any sense to me is dismantle the program and verify it's dismantled and pull the sanctions. But we're not there. This administration will not do that. We are already past that.
Yes,
Madam Chair, I think the economic sanctions that drove them to the negotiating table worked better than I ever anticipated, and the administration had to try. It gave us credibility with the international community. There wasn't a rush to war. It also, I think, puts us in a position to define what a good deal is, which goes to the heart of your question. I think it's a rigorous inspection regime that gives us confidence that they will not have a breakout capability and no ability to enrich uranium beyond peaceful purposes at all. Now, if that cannot be achieved, then we've got a bad deal.
Admiral Fallon?
Somebody made the point earlier that history doesn't exactly repeat itself, but during the Cold War, we were squared off against a communist ideology that was based in the Soviet Union that was diametrically opposed to everything we believed in political and economic and individual freedoms that we held very dear to ourselves, and yet we recognized that we had an interest to try to ensure that we didn't get plunged into yet another conflict with staggering potential consequences in the negative. And so we ended up negotiating with the Soviets. We didn't trust them; they didn't trust us, but we thought that there were some longer-term, higher objectives that needed to be achieved. And I think we're not in a dissimilar situation here. It's not the Soviet Union. We shouldn't give them that credibility. But it's a problem that we just can't keep ignoring. If we come up with an agreement that the negotiators feel is reasonable, then the key thing is going to be an ability to verify the key aspects of that to the best of our ability. And I think that's what's really important.
Senator Reid, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. And I will echo Senator King's remarks. This has been extremely useful, and thank you, gentlemen. One of the thoughts I had listening to Senator King's question was that, the history always sort of drives us. And in the Cold War, we had an existential enemy, the Soviet Union. They were engaged in a lot of provocative activities, sponsoring national liberation movements here and there. They invaded Hungary in the 50s. They were attempting to establish offensive nuclear missiles 90 miles from our shore in the 60s, et cetera. and yet we continue to negotiate with them. And again, I think Admiral Fallon pointed out, we did it with the same kind of skepticism that we all have towards the Iranians. So no one, I think, trusted Khrushchev that much and trusted his successors, et cetera. But I think it's important, as has been suggested by some, I think all of you, that we follow through on these negotiations with the Iranians until we get to a conclusion. I think General Mattis made a very excellent point. We've positioned ourselves now where we're on the high road. You know, we've defined what the good solution is. We have international support. And if they cannot make that standard, then we're in a much stronger position to move collectively. So I think that is important to note. But let me ask a question which it goes to this notion of what I think you said, General Mattis, that we've got to be very clear-eyed when we start something, you know, where it's going to go, which essentially raised the issue of escalation. The notion, if we take a step, it's a solution. We solve the problem. When in fact, in every situation I can think of, the first step will prompt a counter-response by the other side, will prompt a counter-response by us, et cetera. So with respect to the Ukrainians, a simple question. If we were to give defensive weapons to the Ukrainians, which is something that's being seriously considered, what do you think Putin would do? Simply pull his troops out and say, oh, okay, you've seen, you know, I raised you, you saw me, and I fold? Or do you think it'd be something else? And again, will we get into an escalatory situation where we find ourselves in a much more precarious position? You know, just ask all, and then I'll yield to Senator Shaheen.
Senator Reid, every action has a reaction. It's a fundamentally unpredictable situation, but we have to war game it, look ahead. I think that in light of the worsening economic situation, Putin's ability to act independently with some of the things he's been doing is going to start becoming circumscribed. But they can take a lot more stoic view of this inside Russia, as I understand it. And so I believe that it may very well lead to a higher level of violence. But at the same time, I think that it could become akin to Napoleon's bleeding ulcer in Spain. The Ukraine could become the kind of the fulcrum on which his foreign policy is now hammered back in line with the international order of respect for state boundaries and that sort of thing, as he starts having a higher physical cost, more troops coming home dead from this sort of thing. But it's going to be a tragedy so long as Russia decides to continue what they're doing. And we're just asking ourselves, are we willing to support the Ukrainian people who want to defend themselves? And on that one, I'm pretty one way about it. Of course we support them.
John Keane.
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, the Putin strategy is quite clever and maybe even brilliant when you think about it. You know, he's using soldiers in disguise as special operations forces. They come in civilian clothes. They create an uprising that's not even there. And then they appeal for more military assistance. And he provides people who don't identify them in uniform, but they don't identify themselves as what country they come from, so-called soldiers in disguise. So he's trumped up everything to include the requirement for a military response. And he puts the onus then on us that it's up to us to escalate, because this is really this is an uprising. And it's an interesting phenomenon, and I think we're going to continue to see it again and again. So one is we need to deal with this strategy that he's using, and what should we do about it. And number two, I think the harsh reality is that Putin has done all of the escalation himself. And he is the one that brought paramilitary forces in. He is the one that brought conventional military forces in, very sophisticated equipment. He's the one that brought multiple armor and mechanized divisions and put them on the border and then rushed them across the border, tanks, BMPs, artillery, anti-aircraft. It is his forces that shot down an airliner, his weapon systems at least. So all of the escalation has really been done by him. And I believe that providing some assistance to the Ukrainians as much as that would be material assistance, because I always believe that conflict is fundamentally a test of will, and Sun Tzu taught us that the ultimate objective of war is to break your opponent's will. I give arms and assistance to the Ukrainians, not just for the physical capability that it enhances them, but also to demonstrate that we're behind them, to help them with their will and their spine. And they have this natural fortitude, knowing their history, to stand up to it. So that's where I am on it, and I'm not concerned about escalation because Putin has done all of that already.
Admiral Fallon, can you comment, please? My time is running out, but please.
Shortly. We think about Russia, I think it's a great example of a place where we ought to be thinking a little more strategically and not be channeling ourselves into, he did this, and so we're going to have to do this. I think the guy's very opportunistic. He took advantage of an interesting situation. He's aggressive. He's got ego. You could, whatever. But what else might we do to get this guy's attention? First of all, remember that this country has some very significant internal problems. Look at birth rates, look at health and longevity. Look at the reality that it's a one-trick economic pony. And right now the trends are not going in the right direction. So it was highlighted earlier, we've got a phenomenal new energy card in our national capabilities here. How might we think about using that that might get this guy's attention and get him to back it off? He thought he was pretty clever. He went to the Chinese and said, well, let's go make a deal. And the Chinese, hey, you know, it's a way to play off the Americans. So again, we might think about coming around and working things with the Chinese. So I think there's more than one way to skin the cat here. Yes, we stand up for things that we think are important, but I don't think that the only solution here is just to go to throw troops at it. We may think decide it's in our best interest to give support to the Ukrainians. I think we might think very seriously about support to our other Eastern European NATO allies as a priority task. But I think we ought to be thinking a little bit bigger and dealing with Russia a little bit longer term.
Thank you.
Senator Sessions.
Well, thank you all, and I was able to hear all of your opening statements, and I think there's a finer group of statements we've had here in a long time. I think it goes to the core of decisions this Congress needs to make, and really the administration, our Commander-in-Chief, needs to be making. And we are on a path that's it's not going to be successful at the path we're on. And I want to thank you for your honest and direct statements about that. I am more hopeful than some, and I think we can make some progress here. General Keane, I think you acknowledge that it's important that Iraq get its act together with regard to the Shia and the Sunni and the Kurds and be more effective in working together, and that's a critical part of it. But I don't take that to be a statement that we should not seek to be offensive as soon as possible, even right now. It seems to me that you talked about will. I see a recent article by Major General Scales who talks about will and diminishing hope, showing ISIS and ISIL that they're not going to be successful. What are the prospects of us, in your opinion, beginning to retake more territory in Iraq and removing this hope that's out there that seems to be attracting more soldiers from around the region to the ISIS cause?
Well, I think I understand what you're saying. I certainly agree with the policy that we should use local ground indigenous forces as well as coalition air to attempt to retake lost territory. There has been some modest retaking of territory already, but nowhere near what needs to be done to return the integrity and sovereignty to Iraq. That will only take place by a counteroffensive campaign up those two river valleys, one to the west and one to the north, to retake Mosul and Fallujah and Anbar province. All that said, I do think it's prudent to do that with those indigenous forces, but to be robustly assisted, not in the way we are planning to do now, with frontline advisors who will be down where the fighting takes place, which means they are at risk. They're not in direct combat, but they're in combat units that will be fighting. And that's a given.
So that's what you think has got to be done?
Yes. I think that's a prudent measure. Look can we retake Mosul and Anbar province if we put combat brigades on the ground with some coalition brigades now? Can we do that? Yes. Yes, we can do that. But here's the problem with that. One is, I have great difficulty looking U.S. soldiers in the face again to go do something like that after what happened after 2011 and we pulled out of there, because policy decisions squandered the gains. Two, it's not just the issue of retaking Mosul and Fallujah. It's the issue of being able to hold it. ISIS will not stand down after we drive them out of there. We have known enough about this war in Iraq and Afghanistan. You drive an enemy out, that's one thing. And then we have to make certain we hold it and prevent that enemy from coming back. And so that is why I do believe it's the right thing to try to use these local forces, even though we know that's not as strong a hand as we would like, strengthen that hand to the maximum capability we can without introducing ground combat forces, and then put emphasis on, once we clear it out, holding what is there. That will be the challenge, because ISIS will come back and undermine it. And that's why I don't think combat forces now is the right answer, U.S. combat forces. But if we have any lack of confidence that we're going to be able to retake that lost territory, and we still believe it's strategically important for us in Iraq to do that, then I would have combat brigades on reserve in Kuwait as a backup to accomplish the mission if the mission does fail, and that would be coalition brigades as well.
Well, the three of you have commanded CENTCOM. It just strikes me as, let's compare this to Libya. It strikes me we've got quite a different situation. We stood shoulder to shoulder with the Iraqis. We lost thousands of American troops in this effort. And to me, to say that we won't even embed a few soldiers not in the front of the advance at this point to preserve what I think you agree is possible, and to oust ISIL would be a colossal mistake. General Mattis, do you feel a special strategic bond with the Iraqis that we've worked with for over a decade?
Senator, I do. However, in giving you strategic advice, I try to divorce myself from it. We have to be very pragmatic about this. I would tell you that the senior military officers, we all explained that the successes we'd achieved by 2010, 2011 were, and this is a quote, reversible, that the democratic processes and the military capability were too nascent to pull everyone out at one time. What has happened here was foreseeable. The intelligence community was actually very blunt about this potential. And so what we have to look at now is we play the ball where it lies. And right now, I believe we should embed our forward air controllers and our those who can help plan these operations. We're going to have to put them together.
And that could present gains? I mean, doing that would, in your professional opinion, allow us to see gains occur from that.
It
not
would,
a hopeless effort.
Because you're integrating the air and ground effort right at the point of contact. So you would see a much faster decision process. So yes, sir, it would.
My time is up. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
And I certainly share the view that it was a colossal error in 2011 to completely withdraw, and this was predictable, as Senator McCain and others predicted.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Madam Chairwoman. And I want to join in my thanking Senator McCain for convening this hearing, which I think has been extremely valuable. I've been following it while here and then while in a variety of meetings away, and I think your insights and experience reflect each of your extraordinary service to our nation, and I thank you for what you've done to make sure that we are strong and that our security is as robust as possible. And I agree with the point that's been made, I think fairly repeatedly, that we should be doing more to assist Ukraine. The Congress agrees as well, because we passed and the President signed the Ukraine Freedom Support Act of 2014, which as yet, to my knowledge, really has not been implemented. So my question to each of you, because this act is very broad in what it authorizes by way of weaponry and defensive services and training, using that $350 million, what specifically do you think would be most helpful to the Ukrainians? You know, there's a lot of artillery that's being used against them. You've made reference to the Russian troops disguised as civilians. What specifically can we provide? Is it anti-tank missiles? Is it more body armor? Can you be more specific as to what you would advise the President to provide?
Senator, I cannot. I'm not familiar enough with the specifics on that battlefield. I think that's something that gives them more intelligence about where they're being fired from. Counter artillery radar, for example, might be very helpful, but I'm not the right person to answer that. I'm sorry.
General Keane?
What they have been asking for is they want more intelligence than what they currently have, and I believe we have begun to help them with some of that. They do want anti-tank weapons, and those are shoulder-fired missiles essentially, and they also want heavy crew-served weapons. One of the problems we have here is under the previous regime in Ukraine, because of the significant amount of corruption that took place in all the agencies of government, what took place inside the Ukraine military is outrageous in terms of the rip-off of funding and the capabilities that they used to have and no longer have. I mean, they're a mere shadow of their former self, to be frank about it. So while I know some of their desires, I don't know the entire list of what they want.
Yeah, nor do I, Senator. I have no idea what the laundry list is or what really makes sense. I would just caution that, again, whatever we decide to do here will be effective or not in large measure based on what the people in the Ukraine do, and what they do is going to be based on the confidence they have in the leadership. It's been abysmal up to now. I'm not sure where they are, but absent that, we could dump stuff in there all day long, and we're probably not going to be successful. So understanding what's really going on in that country at the political level is really an essential prerequisite to any of this stuff.
Admiral, I'd like to ask you on a different area, and the premise of my question is that you've done a fair amount of work on climate change and environmental issues, but in light of your experience, and I'd open this question to others as well, how big a threat to our national security is potentially what we see happening in climate disruption, the impacts on the availability of sea lanes and water resources in the Middle East and food resources in Africa,
to what extent is climate disruption a national security threat?
I think it's a very, very important national security issue. It's one that we understand very little about, in my opinion. Ramifications of the continuation of the current trends provide all kinds of interesting scenarios. So in one that we've talked about here, the revanchist Russia and Putin's opportunism and what the Russians, what Putin may have in mind for us, he's going to have some significant options pretty soon. You know, when the Arctic continues to lose its ice pack and become basically accessible 12 months of the year, gives them very, very interesting opportunities to move things around and act in ways that they were significantly inhibited in the past. May give them some other opportunities economically, who knows. The melting of the ice caps, rising sea levels, you pick your scenario here, but the trends are pretty clear that water's coming up and land's gonna disappear, and the implications for us in this country, more importantly probably for those that are really in danger, places like Bangladesh that are marginally above sea level right now, and the turmoil that because so all these problems we deal with, almost every single one of them has its roots in instability and insecurity at a very basic level. Not armies, not ISIS running around and pick me up trucks with 50 caliber guns. It's what people feel very close to them. And so if they feel threatened in their livelihoods and their families and their ability to, then things start to get unraveled. And that's the potential that I think we face. I don't want to lie awake at night wringing my hands over all this stuff. However, other things we could be doing, I think, to try to reverse the trends that appear to be moving on pretty strongly. So that's probably another topic for hours discussion, but it gets back to one of my points about credibility. Our credibility as a country, as the world grapples with these things that apply to all of us, I think that the U.S. leadership ought to be paramount, ought to be in the forefront. And in fact, sometimes we're not there. We're not there. We're not voting. We're whether we're denying or avoiding or just defaulting to somebody else. And despite the sometimes incessant gnawing of people, well, the U.S. is always trying to get into this and push. On the other hand, they really the world needs our leadership and involvement. And this is an area where we could actually probably do some good if we put our minds to it.
Thank you very much for that answer, and to all of you for being here today. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you all very much. I know that you've been here a long morning, and so we very much appreciate that. I have just one fundamental question for each of you, and I had a chance to hear your opening statements, but was not here for most of the questioning, so I don't think anybody has covered this aspect of my question. You all are probably aware that DOD recently released a study done by the RAND Corporation that is titled Improving Strategic Competence, Lessons from 13 Years of War. And there have been a number of fairly high-profile articles that have addressed this question as well. And one of the conclusions from the study, as you all know, is that the types of war that the U.S. has fought since World War II have changed. They're no longer conventional combat wars against state actors, but they're more unconventional, irregular warfare by joint forces against non-state actors. And the report, one of the statements in the report says, and I quote, that the joint force and the U.S. government as a whole have displayed an ongoing ambivalence about a lack of proficiency in the non-combat and unconventional aspects of war and conflict against non-state actors. The report goes on to point out 7 lessons from its review, and I won't go through all of them, but the first 2 seem particularly relevant, I think, to today's discussion. One is that the U.S. government displays a persistent weakness in formulating national security strategies, and that this weakness is due in part to the lack of an effective civilian-military process for effective national security policy making. So I wonder if each of you could comment on whether you agree with this conclusion and whether this is something that can be addressed by changing personalities, or do we really need to improve our process for national security decision making? And if you have thoughts about how to do that, Admiral Fallon, you want to go first?
I'll throw myself in front of this train. I agree with it. And I think that my observation of several changes in Washington, to get to be this old, you hang around for enough time, you see a lot of transitions. And one of the weaknesses, I believe, is a belief that an effective national security policy can be created after things are settled down and people get in their places. And, you know, it all sounds nice. Let's get a Secretary of State, let's get a Secretary of Defense and get it in there. But my experience is it's too late. There's no way you're going to be able to come up, that I've seen, to come up with comprehensive, long-term, thoughtful, effective policies once the gun goes off. And that once the inauguration starts, you're off and running. And the reality is, something happens all the time, every single day. Look at all these things and the communication, blah, blah, blah. So all these pressures make it virtually impossible to think strategically, in my observation, once you get in the game. And so a prerequisite for this is a very thoughtful process in advance, using whatever resources are available. A lot of smart people around this country and the world that can inform some pretty good decisions. Again, can't solve everything, but pick a few big ones, decide they're the ones you're going to focus on, would be my advice, and go for it.
Thank you. General Keane?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's a couple of things that aren't correct. First of all, the most predominant form of warfare since war started is unconventional warfare. And that's been well documented. And interesting enough, the prosecutors of unconventional warfare usually lose far more than they win. That is best documented, if you want to see the best reference on it, by Max Boot's sort of history of all of this. He's out of the Council on Foreign Relations and is a prolific, articulate, thoughtful writer. In terms of your comment dealing with the application of force and also government dealing with this kind of experience that we're facing today, I agree that we have not taken a whole of government approach in dealing with some of the challenges we face. What I observed in countless visits over the 13-year experience, you know, in Iraq and Afghanistan, that much of the non-kinetic things that needed to be done in dealing with an unconventional enemy defaulted not to other parts of our government, but largely to the United States military. Even though while they're intelligent and have enormous personal attributes and skill sets that they can apply against anything to be successful, it's not something they were trained and necessarily had experience in, but they became very good at it. And we would always be looking around, where is the rest of our government here to help us do some of these things? So in that regard, I do believe there's much that we can learn from this 13-year experience and how to take a more comprehensive approach and to recognize, well, kinetic actions have a value all of their own, certainly, and that's blatantly obvious. Non-kinetic actions do as well. And we can do much better at that than what we have done.
Thank you. General Mattis, my time is up, but do you have anything you want to add?
Just very quickly, Senator, I would just point out that we have to improve the process, assuming there is a process. I've been unable to identify one recently. I think it starts with the assumption we must develop a sound strategy or we're going to waste lives and our treasury and our country's future. I think, too, we need to move authority back to the Senate-confirmed Secretaries of State and Defense and not concentrate it in a small but mushrooming, at the same time, national security staff that does not have the foreign service officers and the trained military officers who can actually develop what you're looking for here. I don't think we can adopt one preclusive form of warfare, and here my point is the enemy will always try the kind of warfare they think we're least ready for. One of the reasons you can say, or the RAND study can say, we did not have state-on-state warfare is because we probably prevented it. That's a pretty great war from my point of view, the one that never happened, because we were ready for it. And last, I would just point out that unconventional warfare always takes a long time. The U.S. cavalry against the American Indian from 1850 to 1905 was decades long, and this sense of rushing things, for example, setting withdrawal dates and telling the enemy in advance when we're leaving, probably contributes to the endless wars that we get into. And we're engaged in a violent political argument with political Islam right now, and we need the diplomatic and developmental tools alongside our military. And for a country that could put up Voice of America and send the truth right inside the Iron Curtain, we're not fighting the war anywhere near as smartly as we did back during the Cold War. I think you should aggressively go after these areas that you're bringing up, ma'am.
Thank you all very much.
Senator Graham.
Thank you. Y'all have we've probably violated the Geneva Convention when it comes to the three of y'all, but you've been terrific. I've really enjoyed this. Back to Iraq, looking forward. Let's assume that we can get a more cohesive government, that the new prime minister is better than the old, that we can get a Iraqi-trained force, the Kurds help us. Eventually we take back Mosul, Anbar province gets solidified. Once again, that's a big if. If they ask us in the future to leave a residual force, would you recommend that we honor that request?
Yes, sir.
No, absolutely. I mean, they're going to ask for sure, Senator. And how could we say no to that, given the circumstance?
And what I want to tell the American people the best I can, it's in our interest for Iraq to turn out well. Do you all agree with that? Whether we should go in or not is behind us. We're there. And I guess my theory of all this is a line of defense for America is best achieved by having allies in the region that we can work with, that will fight this radical ideology at its core. And the hardest part of getting this war won, I believe, is just the patience, strategic patience that comes from investing in others. As unreliable as they are and as frustrating as they are, the alternative is Fortress America, and I just don't believe that works. Now, as we get ready to go into Mosul, I think, General Keane, you said that the Iraqi timetable is probably different than ours. Just imagine for a moment as an American politician that there was a town in your state occupied by a foreign force, and the federal government was telling you, or some outside entity was telling you, that it may be a year or two before you can go back in. I think the new Sunni defense minister is in a real spot here. How long is he going to allow his people in Mosul to suffer under the hands of a vicious enemy? So we have to realize politically that an Iraqi politician has a different calculation than an American political leader here. But it is in our advantage, don't you, in our interest, to make sure the Iraqis do this right. Is that correct?
Yes.
They're not ready by this spring, are they?
I'm not on the ground, but talking to people who are, I don't think so, not even close.
Admiral Fallon, would you be worried about a spring offensive?
I don't know what the timing is because I haven't been in dialogue with these guys, but my sense is there are probably things we can do in advance if you accept that they're not ready in a large force.
Right.
I think there's some things we can continue to do, and just last week, the sense is that we're starting to go back and claw back. When I say we, our allies over there. So maybe they're not ready for the big thing. But then again, I have a hard time, frankly, envisioning the kind of activity that we saw when we had to retake Fallujah for the second and third times, going in there street to street. I'm not sure that's that's a scenario that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I agree. But somebody's going to have to take Mosul back, right? And we want it to be Iraqis. Do you agree with the idea of maybe 10,000 is the right number to have in terms of support, General Mattis? Does that make sense to you?
I'd look more at the capabilities, sir, but we've got to have enough forward air controllers, enough trainers, enough advisors to actually make a difference.
Does that make sense to you, Admiral Fallon, whatever enough is?
I have no idea what the exact number is, but you got to have people with the right skill sets.
So just to the American people, we're going to have some boots on the ground if we want to get this right. The hope is we don't have to have the 82nd Airborne going back in. Real quickly with Syria. I can understand how we get there in Iraq. I really don't understand how we're going to get there in Syria unless we have a regional force to supplement whatever Free Syrian Army we can muster. Very quickly, how do we dislodge ISIL from Syria? And if you don't, how can you sustain your gains in Iraq? And finally, the end game is a real problematic situation in Syria. How do you salvage a Syria with Assad still in power? So how do you go in and get them out on the ground? Who does it? And should we leave Assad in power as an end state? And if we do, what can we expect from that?
Well, I'll try to answer that as we've tried to answer it in the past. And this is tough, complicated, and very uncertain. But here's what I believe. First of all, the mission that we have right now is not to destroy ISIS in Syria. It is to degrade it, but to destroy ISIS in Iraq and retake lost territory. I believe that is not a very good mission because I don't think you separate Syria and Iraq. I think you see them as a whole cloth in terms of what you have to do against that enemy. All that said, if our intent is to destroy ISIS in Syria, the only way that can be done will be with ground force supported by air power. And there is no ground force in sight with the capability to do that. And you know better than I, because of the briefing you got from General Nagata, at the pace we're doing that, 5,000 or so a year, we're not going to get there. We're not even close. So in my mind, you have to push back on Assad because of what he's doing to what exists of the Free Syrian Army. That brings in the coalition very strongly in support of what's taking place in Syria. Then you bring Turkey to the table, you bring UAE to the table, you bring Jordan to the table, and you bring Saudi Arabia to the table. Now they're at the table, and you've got their interest. They have got to be the coalition force that's going to drive ISIS out of there with our assistance.
Do two of you agree with that?
Yeah, the question is, how do you convince these people to actually go do that?
Right.
Is going to be the real challenge.
General Mattis, do you agree with that concept?
I do, Senator, but the devil's in the details. And we have got to figure out what it looks like or what we want it to look like at the end. Is Assad still there or not? There are some who say we can't put Syria back together if Assad's part of it. There's others who say he's the best of the worst options. We've got to get this straight in our heads first, and then we can give you a lot of answers, sir, about how best to accomplish it.
Senator King. You're all set? Thank you. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and this has been an extraordinarily useful hearing. I just have one comment to make, and we have repeatedly talked about the need for residual forces in a condition-based situation in Afghanistan and other places when we commit ourselves. And looking at 2011, we're all looking back, and I think it's important to note that the stage was probably set in 2008 when the United States and the government of Iraq entered into a formal agreement to remove all troops by 2011. That was signed by President Bush and Prime Minister Maliki. And it was signed under the threat that if they didn't, our troops would be out even sooner. I think December 31st of 2008, our international protections expired. And it goes to General Mattis' point, is when we signed something formally saying, you know, we're out, even though there was an expectation that we might be able to negotiate, it's awful tough once you've got a deal between the U.S., our president, their prime minister, ratified by their parliament to reverse. Also particularly difficult if we signed in 08 with 100,000 troops on the ground, and we're already down to a much smaller figure by 2011. And I think it's important to put this in context, because this issue of residual forces with a condition-based sort of level is something we have to consider as we look, again, as Senator Graham suggested, going forward in Iraq and also going forward in Afghanistan. And I want to thank you. I don't necessarily need a comment. You can write me, mail me, email me. I want to thank the chairwoman for running an excellent hearing.
I want to thank Senator Reid, and I appreciate all three of you being here today. I think it was evident your tremendous military experience, and all of us appreciated a very substantive hearing and your best advice, and we really appreciate everything that you've done and continue to do for our country. So thank you all, and thank you all. We're very impressed with your endurance as well.
The Senate Armed Services Committee is holding a confirmation hearing next week to consider Ashton Carter to be the next Defense Secretary. President Obama nominated Mr. Carter to succeed Chuck Hagel. The military is holding a formal farewell ceremony for Chuck Hagel tomorrow, which we'll cover on the C-SPAN networks.